This is Audible.
The Last Air Force One, a post-apocalyptic thriller. Black Autumn Companion Series, Book 1. Written by Jeff Kirkham and Jason Ross. Narrated by Kevin Pierce. Chapter 1. A nuclear blast looked nothing like a mushroom cloud from so close. Dutch's mind struggled to find solid ground. The same thing had happened on September 11th, 2001, when he watched an airliner hurl into the Twin Towers on TV. Just like that morning 20 years ago, President Nathaniel Dutch McAdams' mouth hung agape and his knees went to water as he watched America being incinerated by its enemies. The picture on the television jerked side to side. The iPhone cameraman must have been running away from the blast while filming toward it. A massive sphere of light wrapped around a cluster of high-rise office buildings. The light overwhelmed the tiny camera, and the buildings vanished in a starburst. A split second later, the light receded, and the camera adjusted to the exposure, the buildings still standing. The President of the United States exhaled. He had been holding his breath for the last 20 seconds. Returning to this terrible reality, he watched as one of the wealthiest cities in America crouched before a thunderclap of flame. The windows of the office building vaporized as the overpressure of the blast pulsed through the high-rise, sucking atomized glass and 100,000 pieces of paper into thin air. Dutch watched for falling bodies, but saw only ticker tape floating leisurely toward Earth. He already knew that the shock wave wouldn't be followed by white-hot flame. Otherwise, the cameraman wouldn't have uploaded the video to the internet. If the man had burned up, the president and his staff wouldn't be watching him run for his life on the big screen TV in the Oval Office. Apparently, the explosion wasn't enough to incinerate all of downtown Los Angeles. Still, the ground in L.A. must have heaved like a kicking mule. With the cameraman running pell-mell, it was hard to tell. The cameraman slowed, either from overexertion or from the realization that the fireball wasn't going to immolate him. A heavy-set man with a wispy beard turned the camera on himself, gasping for air and stating the obvious. "Los Angeles has been hit by a nuclear weapon. I'm going to post this on Instagram and run for my car. Don't know how long I have before the fallout gets me. I want my family to know I love them. Goodbye." The TV flipped back to a blonde-haired man in a suit sitting behind a desk at a Fox News studio, probably in New York City. The newscaster began to repeat what everyone who had watched the last 15 seconds already knew. Los Angeles had been attacked. Dutch blinked away his amazement and resumed his role as the most powerful man on Earth. "What else do we know?" he asked his team assembled in his office. They'd been working almost non-stop for 2 days on a financial crisis that had already been threatening to swamp the world economy even prior to the nuke. This latest attack, and it could only be an attack, raised 1,000 questions. Who was aggressing against the United States, and what did it have to do with the dirty bomb in Saudi Arabia and the crash of the stock market? The string of events made absolutely no sense to McAdams. Nobody from the president's team spoke. The newscaster droning in the background, repeating essentially the same sentence over and over. The doors to the Oval Office burst inward, and Dutch's contingent of Secret Service agents fanned out into the room, peering at his staff with unnecessary suspicion. "Mr. President, we're taking you to Air Force One right now." Dutch had argued with his protective detail before, and he'd always lost. Whatever power he held as president didn't extend to bending the will of the government organizations he supposedly commanded. Secret Service policy, as with all governmental agencies, spanned many dozen presidents. There's only so much he could do to alter the institutional will of the over 400 agencies, sub-agencies, and departments, many with more than 200 years of bureaucratic inertia. Most days, Dutch felt like a conductor standing in front of an orchestra, the musicians with bags over their heads. He grabbed his laptop and cell phone before his security dragged him away. "Janice, get Sam Greeny and Zach Jackson to meet me at Andrews. They need to be on that plane." He turned to the Secret Service agent holding his arm. "Where's my family?" "In a helo on their way to Andrews, sir." "Thank you." "Robbie, come with us." Robbie LaForth, Dutch's chief of staff, looked rattled. The younger man jumped up from the sofa and blundered toward the phalanx of Secret Service agents now heading out the door. "Robbie, you're going to need your laptop." The president pointed toward the coffee table as he was being pulled from his office and into the hallway. Chapter 2. Upon boarding Air Force One, Dutch broke ranks with his protective detail and headed back into the section of the plane set aside for reporters and his office staff. He needed to check on his family. His wife Sharon, his 23-year-old daughter Abigail, and his 20-year-old son Teddy were buckled in, ready for the Boeing 747-8 to get in the air. Dutch noticed a cluster of 3 Special Forces operators in full military kit speaking privately with Secretary of Defense Sam Greene. He overheard something about a full frange loadout, which meant nothing to Dutch. His Secret Service men stood in a separate cluster, eyeballing the other gunmen. Nothing about the scene alarmed the president. Greene's personal security detail were Army Delta Force, and his own Secret Service detail distrusted everyone as a general rule. After trading a quick touch of the hand with his wife and a smile with each of his now adult children, Dutch strode with purpose toward the front of the gleaming aircraft. The glamour of Air Force One still hadn't worn off on Dutch. Aside from the top-secret features of the plane, no effort had been spared for style and comfort. Even the office, guest, security, and press sections in the back of the hulking fuselage put most first-class sections to shame, with wide leather seats, each with an array of connection and entertainment options embedded in their consoles. On every bulkhead, crystal and LCD screens silently scrolled through passenger safety instructions produced exclusively for the president's personal jumbo jet. Heading toward the nose of the plane, the duties of governing the greatest empire the world had ever seen took precedence over design. The main hallway doglegged to the port side of the plane, affording space for a large conference and dining room, a senior staff office, the plane's galley, a small medical office, and the Oval Office. The President and First Lady's executive suite filled the nose of the aircraft, where one might expect the pilots. The Boeing 747, one of the first jumbo jets, not only ran much wider than most jets, but offered an upper deck in the front of the aircraft, where Air Force One housed a state-of-the-art communication center and the flight cockpit. Everything about Air Force One, from its fit and finish to its capability to stay aloft indefinitely through mid-air refueling, spoke to the incomprehensible might of the United States of America. Stepping aboard the aircraft was like walking into the throne rooms of medieval Europe. Allies and rivals alike were to take notice. The USA ruled the earth. Whereas the Oval Office in the White House had been packed with economic and diplomatic advisors, the front section of Air Force One bristled with military men. Secretary of Defense Sam Greene sat on Dutch's couch, and uniformed servicemen hustled past on their way to the communication center on the second floor of the aircraft. The use of nuclear weapons would typically have that effect, Dutch reasoned. Still, even as a Republican, he had developed the habit of leaning away when the war hawks appeared. Almost from day one as president, Dutch found himself choking back on the military, as though it were a pit bull straining on its leash. It made Dutch think of one of his father's favored truisms: to a hammer, everything's a nail. "I would love an update," President Dutch McAdams requested as he settled behind his desk. The plane hadn't taken to the air yet, but he had just spent 25 minutes in a helicopter without any news. SecDef Sam Greene would have the latest information, given that the military undoubtedly had aircraft circling over Los Angeles, and maybe even troops on the ground by now. The Secretary of Defense would probably become Dutch's best source for hard data from this point forward, no matter how much Dutch would have preferred to use domestic resources. "Mr. President, F-35s out of Miramar are currently overflying Los Angeles Harbor, and we have zero indication of a follow-on threat as of this time," Sam reported. "Uncorroborated initial SITREPs indicate the device detonated 4 kilometers out to sea, and the damage to Los Angeles proper was collateral overpressure and not the primary detonation." Dutch understood the words, but Sam Greene had gotten into the habit of overusing military jargon since his posting to Secretary of Defense. Sam had served briefly as an Air Force officer 3 decades back, primarily working in intelligence and then working for the CIA. After that, he had moved to the private sector. Dutch had hoped that over 20 years in business would have made Sam a bridge between the military and civilian worlds. But during the last 2 years as SecDef, Sam had become something of a fanboy of the generals, officers, and Special Forces soldiers that reported to him as Secretary of Defense. Perhaps Sam's time in the military hadn't been enough to answer that burning question inside most men. Am I a warrior or am I not? "Well, thank you, Sam. Could you please say that again, maybe in a way we're all sure to understand?" Sam Greeny blinked back the veiled criticism and ran his hands through his cropped gray hair as he gathered his thoughts. He tucked his dress shirt into his belt, tidying up the fabric around his trim waist. In the last 2 years, he'd picked up the military officer habit of maintaining his fitness, despite being over 60 years old. Well, in civilian terms, I'd say the bomb seems to have been a small one, maybe even a backpack nuke. We have no idea why, but it exploded 3 miles offshore from Los Angeles. We're still trying to figure out why it didn't hit L.A. directly. We have hearsay reports of LAPD intercepting a small sea craft right before detonation. There are no hostile warships in the area, and we have no reason to believe enemy forces are in theater. But it's hard to say for sure because from the sky, L.A. appears to be in total chaos. The airplane rumbled as it taxied on the runway, causing a short pause in the briefing. Chaos? Zach Jackson asked. As per Dutch's request, both his SecDef and Attorney General had made it onto the plane in time for takeoff. Dutch had the same question. How had the bomb affected the rioting that was already going on in Southern California? Los Angeles had been in a crisis even before the nuclear attack. More accurately, Orange County, California had been experiencing blackouts and brownouts over the previous 2 days, and the power problems had spread to the margins of L.A., as had rioting and civil disorder. Dutch had never been entirely clear on the difference between Los Angeles and Orange County. They both seemed to be part of the same sprawling mass of strip malls, commercial buildings, and tract homes, stretching from Camp Pendleton in the south to Ventura in the north. Orange County had been experiencing rioting, as had some parts of Los Angeles, due to several days of power outages. Dutch and his staff were just working on a federal response to the rioting when they were interrupted by news of the nuclear attack. Like Zach Johnson, the president wanted to know if the attack had stopped the rioting. They were both probably thinking of 9/11, when America quickly unified in the face of an attack on one of their great cities. Well, Sam Greeny explained, we're talking about F-35 pilots looking down from several thousand feet going .75 Mach. It's not like they can see the expression on people's faces. They're telling us a mass exodus is underway worse than before, if that's even possible. I have troops rolling from El Segundo to give us eyes on the ground. I expect a report any minute. He looked down, pulling his cell phone from his pocket and thumbing the screen, scrolling through messages, probably looking for a report from L.A. Is that a report from L.A., Sam? The president prodded the Secretary of Defense, who had become engrossed in something on his cell phone. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir. I'm trying to find out more. Sam Greeny sat down on the couch between Robbie LaForth, Chief of Staff, and Janice Brown, the president's personal secretary. I'll let you know more when I know more, Sam Greeny said, before getting lost in the data stream. Chapter 3. Everyone had been cleared out of the Oval Office by the flight attendant for takeoff. The president could buckle into his office chair, but everyone else had to take their assigned seats until they reached cruising altitude. Dutch pondered the irony of the moment. California might be spiraling out of control, caught in a grab bag of disasters, but the pinnacle decision-makers, upon whom millions of people relied for leadership, were being herded to their seats by a flight attendant just to make absolutely sure nobody bumped their head during takeoff. Dutch smiled, despite the tension grinding in his gut. How had the world come to this? Diminutive safety concerns and ponderous policy outweighing common sense. 9/10 of the straightforward actions he wanted to take as president had been stymied by political exigency, social sensitivity, and good old-fashioned inertia. Doing the smart thing had never been more difficult in politics, even with mind-boggling technology at their fingertips. For the 1,000th time, he compared his presidency to Abraham Lincoln's. Oh, how Dutch would have loved to lead the country back when a president could turn the rudder and the ship would follow. He closed his eyes and tried to make sense of the deluge of information he faced since waking up that morning. What had started out as a terrorist attack in the Middle East had become an energy crisis, which had transformed into a stock market problem. Then a bomb exploded off the California coast. Dutch failed to grasp the connection. It felt like a tangle of string, and he couldn't find the end. This happened a lot as POTUS. He faced so many data points, factors, and question marks that it became impossible to get them all on the same map inside his head. Having done this job for 2 years now, Dutch had a lot more sympathy for the guy he replaced. Doing the smart thing, even with more information than anyone on the planet, still involved a ton of guesswork. He sat back in his chair and inventoried the events of the last few days, stripping them of drama as best he could. Unless his people had missed something, the first big dollop of trouble had been the dirty bomb hitting the oil transfer station in Saudi Arabia 3 days before. The CIA's best guess was that Iran mounted the nuke attack, for some reason that only made sense to that maniac religious dictator who ran their country. Putting the whys and wherefores aside, the bomb in Saudi Arabia had generated a stampede in the energy markets. The U.S. had been a net exporter of energy for some time, but the commodity pricing of oil still rocked and rolled based on global factors. How much oil was coming out of Siberia? What craziness was going on in the minds of OPEC? How were the Arabs, Jews, and Iranians behaving this week? American gas on the American mainland was secure, but the American commodities market was not secure at all. Rising tides lift all boats, as the saying went, but plunging tides also dumped all boats in the mud. With the price of oil skyrocketing, the first boat to hit the seafloor had been the Union Pacific Railroad. The venerable old railroad's sickly stock had been propped up for years by cheap diesel fuel and the coal transport market. But coal had become a swear word for the eco-minded denizens of America. Coal transport from mines to power plants meant a hell of a lot to Union Pacific Railroad and their shareholders. When diesel fuel doubled in price, the railroad stock fell off a cliff, and their fuel contracts hit stop losses, giving the fuel suppliers a chance to renege on their deals. The ensuing contractual stutter step temporarily halted all rail movement in the western United States, which meant that coal couldn't get to where it needed to go. No matter how much the eco-social justice crowd hated coal, the dirty fossil fuel still produced 30% of the power for their electric cars and cappuccino makers. Like a family with an awkward homeless uncle, America couldn't just abandon coal without first figuring out a sensible game plan. But the collapse of the energy market had rendered those questions moot. Union Pacific and the coal it shipped had taken a premature dirt nap, and Dutch had no idea how a president was supposed to fix things when markets convulsed entirely on their own. On the opposite side of the political divide from the eco-minded, the ultra-right citizen militias had been on edge lately. While they generally liked Dutch as president, the militia types couldn't stand the federal government. The week prior, there had been an unfortunate shooting between a militia group in Texas and a federal park ranger. 5 men had died. On top of that, the dirty bomb attack in the Middle East had the alt-right screaming false flag operation, though it wasn't clear who they thought had secretly orchestrated the bombing. For all Dutch knew, they could be right. He'd seen stranger things in his time in politics. As fate would have it, the biggest power plant supplying Orange County and the eastern third of Los Angeles County sat on a hotbed of militia activity. The town of Delta, Utah, one of the same power plants that missed their coal shipment because the Union Pacific Railroad lost its diesel supplier. The Delta, Utah power plant was hundreds of miles from Los Angeles, but losing that chunk of electricity during the end of summer in sweltering Los Angeles basin had an impact nobody might have imagined. When air conditioners ground to a halt in Orange County and L.A., on top of the problems with the stock market, some urban Californians took to the streets, looting and rioting, with social media accelerating the civil unrest into another iteration of the L.A. riots. At that juncture, the details got fuzzy for Dutch, which was a sure sign that someone in the chain of bureaucracy had been obfuscating his information. Dutch's money was on the latest loudmouthed Hollywood actor/governor of California. He and Dutch hadn't seen eye to eye, even though the president was raised in rural California before being swept away by the Ivy League scene on the East Coast. The president had grown up in the tiny mountain town of Bishop, California, a far cry from the metropolitan scramble of Oakland, where the California governor went to high school. Somehow, in a heavy-handed attempt to make sure that the coal supply was restored to the power plant in Utah, the governor of the state of California sent National Guard vehicles into a neighboring state to see that the coal arrived. By some perverse stroke of luck or genius, the militia group in Delta captured the California National Guard's advance force and blockaded the town. Dutch didn't know if anyone had died in the conflict, but he knew that once the Delta Desert Patriots pointed guns at American servicemen, there had been no turning back for the little town and its erstwhile patriots. As far as Dutch knew, the town and the power plant were still locked down by camouflaged radicals. This morning, which seemed like yesterday to Dutch, there had been so much crisis on his desk that he hadn't had time to address the militia group seizing control of a town and a power plant. Before he could get to it, someone rushed into the Oval Office and turned on Fox News, where Dutch and his staff witnessed the first nuclear weapon ever used against the United States of America. Dutch could follow the bouncing ball from the Saudi Arabian attack to the failure of Union Pacific Railroad to the shutdown of the power plant. He could even see how the destruction of a major oil pumping station and tanker loading facility in the Middle East could cause the stock market to hiccup. Many corporations had been flying high for years on cheap gas. Expensive gas would hit a lot of stock prices. But how did a small militia in a tiny town in Utah come to play such a pivotal role in escalating civil disorder in Southern California? What the hell did any of this have to do with the nuclear attack in L.A.? Could the Iranians have mounted the nuke attack in L.A. as a follow-up to the Saudi nuke? Why would one be a dirty bomb and the other be a fission bomb? And why would the bombs be 3 days apart? Now in his mid-60s, President Dutch McAdams had seen his share of weird chains of events. Life is long and strange, he liked to say. Not every puzzle piece fit into a puzzle. Random chance resulted in peculiar, sometimes spooky combinations, like the triggers that started World War I, or even the financial collapse of 2008. Black swan events, as economists like to call them. People imagine that random chance played out more evenly than it actually did. While flipping tails 10 times in a row was unlikely, in practice it happened surprisingly often. Human history flipped tails 10 times in a row with regularity, and then mankind paid the price with interest. There might be no connection whatsoever between the two nuclear devices, or it might be a nefarious plot, or it all might be a series of hapless accidents. Dutch might find the link tomorrow, or he might never find it. Even the president wasn't omniscient, he knew all too well. But Dutch had been elected by the people of America to diagnose problems and fix them, and he would be damned if he wouldn't do exactly that. Chapter 4. Dutch awoke at 5 a.m. on Air Force One, his cell phone vibrating, overfull with an alarming stream of text messages. After hours of pawing through unsatisfying slivers of news, he and Sharon had finally called it a night. They continued their 3,000-mile circuit over America that would keep them away from the coast, where an enemy submarine could conceivably shoot them out of the sky. As soon as the military had more solid answers on the attack, they would return home to Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, D.C. The glamour of the airplane had already worn off, and Dutch yearned to be on the ground. To his knowledge, they'd never done this before, moving a president to war flight status during a heightened threat. President Bush had spent only 3 hours in the air after the 9/11 attacks, and that had been to get him from a grade school in Florida to Strategic Air Command in Omaha, Nebraska. Dutch lifted his window shade and looked out into the still, dark morning sky, the slight orange scrim of dawn etching a line to the east of their flight path. 2 red lights blinked in the distance, probably the E-4B night watch that served as a flying command center in case of nuclear war. Thank God the Secret Service hadn't dragged him onto that plane instead of Air Force One. He and Sharon would never have gotten a good night's sleep in the Super Spy Command Center. It would have been worse than trying to sleep in a hospital. The president's cell phone buzzed again. Dutch kicked himself for getting talked into accepting an iPhone. His staff now controlled his attention 24/7. At least prior to the phone, they had to wait for him to wake up in the morning before giving him his marching orders. Now they could reach into his sleep and jerk him back to reality whenever they saw fit. So many people relied on him, Dutch was afraid to turn the damn thing off, even at night. It didn't matter anyway. He had barely slept, feverish with concern over the nuclear attack and the civil disorder in California. His mind had been flipping bits of information until the wee hours of the morning, hungry to connect the dots. Dutch hunted around blindly in the dark stateroom, trying not to wake Sharon, until he found his reading glasses on the nightstand next to the bed. Jesus, God in heaven, he swore, reading the first text on his phone. What's wrong, Dutch? Sharon asked, startling awake. Homeland Security thinks we're being hit with a cyber attack. Power plants along the East Coast are now having problems. When people start waking up in the east, we could be in for more power outages. Who's attacking us? We don't know, but the usual suspect would be Russia. They've probed our power systems before, and they managed to shut down Ukraine's power grid a couple of years ago. Why would they hit us? She asked, sitting up in bed. The Russians are like that. If they sense weakness, they don't let the opportunity pass them by, even though tanking our economy would likely tank theirs. Dutch moved around the room, searching for clothes. Sharon turned on the reading light to make it easier for her husband to dress. Will we retaliate? Dutch chuffed. Not unless we have proof, and I'm guessing we have bigger fish to fry today. 6 metro areas in California rioted through the night. California state guards having trouble putting down the civil disorder. Apparently only 60% of their guardsmen showed up for duty last night. They're not sure how many more will make it in today. Dutch slipped on a clean undershirt and pulled on a tracksuit he found in a drawer. Like everything else in their life, someone had thought through this potential outcome ahead of time and stocked the presidential suite with clothes for him and Sharon. He brushed his teeth and waded into the early morning maelstrom of the conference room, his gray and white streaked hair sticking up in the back. What's the situation? Dutch took note of the staffers who had probably been awake most of the night, or at least since Homeland called in the cyber attack. His entire staff, plus the Attorney General, were present. SecDef Greeny wasn't there, but Dutch doubted he'd slept much either, not with a cyber attack underway. As suspected, Sam Greeny appeared in the doorway sipping a mug of coffee. He'd probably been upstairs in the communications center. Good morning, Mr. President. Robbie, his chief of staff, began the brief. As you saw in my text, Homeland Security detected a virus working its way through our power companies and their transfer points, starting at 3:35 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Homeland is organizing a response, but the virus has been self-replicating, and we can assume that it's present in every power grid system across the nation and the eastern half of Canada. Have we launched our countermeasures? Dutch had been briefed on a possible cyber attack on the power grid, and he knew that Homeland Security had prepared a defensive response. Well, this virus caught Homeland doing a scheduled update on their systems. They won't be back online until 8 a.m. Eastern. By then, the worm may have generated too many iterations in the system to isolate it. Dutch glowered. Why the hell did DHS run a system update the night after a nuclear strike against the country? Robbie quailed at the unusual display of anger. I'm sorry, sir, but nobody in management told the programmers to hold off on the computer update. Those programmer guys kind of live in their own world. They'll eventually eradicate the virus, but it won't be as quick as if we'd responded immediately. Homeland anticipates about 15 days of power interruptions before they get it under control. Dutch dropped into one of the chairs around the conference table. What else? California's requesting federal troops. Last night they reported rioting and looting and... Robbie looked down at a list he'd written on a yellow legal pad. Los Angeles, Santa Ana, Sacramento, Oakland, San Jose, and San Diego. They're due to report in at 8 a.m. Pacific to assess damage and to discuss rules of engagement. But the governor forewarned us they would be requesting federal troop support. Careful, Zach Jackson, Attorney General, interrupted. Congress altered the Posse Comitatus Act during the Bush administration and then repealed it. We don't have the same free hand that they had back in the Los Angeles riots. Dutch narrowed his eyes but said nothing. That isn't all, Mr. President. His chief of staff turned to Sam Greeny as though they'd already discussed the next piece of information. Other cities are experiencing sympathetic riots based on what social media is calling racially biased distribution of electrical power. They're convinced that the power companies are channeling available electricity to white upscale neighborhoods, and they claim to have proof in the form of videos posted on Facebook, Instagram, Twitch, and Twitter. We're getting reports of minor looting last night in nearly every major metropolitan city in the United States. Tonight it might get worse. Let me make sure I'm getting this straight. Dutch bristled. Cities without interruption to their electrical service are rioting because of some racial bias bullshit in other cities that they heard about on Facebook? He leaned forward in his chair, fury by now coming off him in waves. Yes, sir. The movement already has a name. Robbie looked down at his notes. They're calling it Fair Power. Dutch threw himself back in his chair. People are probably dying from radiation poisoning from a nuclear attack on our country, and people in Chicago are rioting because they think some races are getting more electricity than others in Los Angeles? Is that what I'm hearing you say? Because this is not how America responds to an attack on our soil. We proved that with 9/11. The president's staff shuffled their feet and looked anywhere but at their leader. Most of them were younger than Dutch by a fair margin. 2 people in the room were millennials. It seemed that the only person in the Oval Office who didn't understand how much America had changed since 9/11 was the President of the United States. Sam Greeny sipped his coffee, still standing in the hallway, leaning against the bulkhead of the airplane. Dutch calmed himself and turned toward his Secretary of Defense, the closest person to his age in the conference room. Sam, what do we know about the nuke? Well, Mr. President, we know it was a baby nuke, probably something from when we were making devices that could fit into a piece of luggage. We have a location on all ours, so that leaves a short list of possible provocateurs. It'll take some time to winnow down the list. We're spinning up Ospreys this morning out of 29 Palms with Marine Corps radiation experts and flying them to Ground Zero in L.A. We can't get anything into L.A. that wasn't already there by ground because half of Southern California is trying to drive out of the state all at the same time. And the majority of cars will be running out of gas en route. It'll take weeks to clear the blocked roads. What do we know about the people, Sam? How many died because of the bomb? What's our radiation exposure? Dutch fired back. Hardly anything, really. Our best guess right now is we might have lost 80 people, mostly in boats, and others who crashed their cars because of the flash. The California civil authorities are barely picking up their phones in the Los Angeles area, presumably because the place is like Mogadishu right now. We'd love a chance to get some eyes on Los Angeles Harbor from the Coast Guard, but they're scrambling to put together a hazmat team from Monterey, 400 miles to the north. There used to be a coastie hazmat team in Los Angeles Harbor, but less than half those guys were answering their phones, and the Coast Guard base got blown all to hell by the blast. The Coast Guard uses union dock workers to get their boats underway, and you can bet dollars to donuts that none of those union guys are going to show up right after a nuke. Cell service in L.A. is working fine, actually, but a lot of people aren't answering their phones right now. They're busy freaking out, I guess. So we won't know the radiation exposure until your team from either Monterey or 29 Palms gets there? Correct, Mr. President. But the winds are favorable. SoCal's getting Santa Ana winds, which are hellacious for wildfires, but good for fallout. We're speculating most of the particles from the nuke are blown out to sea. The bad news is that the civil disorder in town has sparked fires that are now blowing into full-fledged wildfires. I know we already deployed FEMA to the site. When do they arrive? Silence stretched until the President gave in. Apparently nobody wanted to vouch for FEMA. Robbie, will you please find out where FEMA is? Americans might be dying from radiation exposure as we speak. I want to know how long it'll be before we turn this thing around. Yes, Mr. President. Robbie vacillated between leaving the Oval Office or staying to take further orders. All bullshit aside, Mr. President, Sam Greeny took another sip of his coffee. FEMA's not going to get into L.A. anytime soon. Their air assets are skeletal, and they can't do anything without semi-trucks. There's not a single road in or out of Los Angeles that isn't choked balls to butt with abandoned vehicles, or will be by this afternoon. The Attorney General spoke up. I'm concerned about the Marine Corps radiation team flying into L.A. Will they be armed? Their presence might be construed as a violation of the Insurrection Act if they conduct an armed mission within the U.S. There's a small carve-out in the law for using federal troops to secure fissionable materials, but I'll have to check on that. Zach, the President talked over top of his Attorney General. We're friends, right? So you know I mean it with respect when I tell you to shut the fuck up. I need you to be less of a lawyer and more of a patriot right now. Chapter 5. I sure as hell hope you have solutions, Sam, because I'm sick of dead ends and colossal fuck-ups. The President continued his tirade as soon as the door to the Oval Office closed behind his retreating staff. Sam Greeny, Secretary of Defense, braved the President's meltdown without any apparent bump in his blood pressure. The plane did a small shudder, causing Sam to steady his coffee to keep it from spilling on the President's rug. I have solutions, Dutch, but you're not going to like them, the SecDef drawled. I'm up for absolutely anything that saves lives and gets us back on our game. Are you going to hit me up about counter-strikes against the Russians? No, Mr. President, that's the long game. We don't have the luxury of playing the long game right now. Nothing we do against the Russians is going to stop the virus that's already in our computers. And I doubt the Russians will mount an analog attack. They don't need to do anything more. We're doing a great job of screwing one another on Facebook and Insta whatever. Then what's next on your list? I've already given the Fifth Fleet a warning order that they'll sail for the States in 5 days, and the Third Fleet's already streaming for home in Southern California. I'm frankly more worried about the inner-city riots. In my mind, they're the critical threat. Dutch always had a sneaking suspicion that Sam Greeny was a bit of a racist, so he cocked his ear, preparing to take this next part with a grain of salt. I believe we might be facing a social media psych warfare attack from our enemies. Probably Russia, maybe China, quite possibly both. This bit about fair power reeks of a social media play by the Russians. They pit us against each other on issues of race or hashtag blah blah blah, and we never fail to take the bait. Most Americans strut around thinking it was our idea. The CIA knows for a fact that Russians are manipulating us through social media, but we just don't know how much. Dutch McAdams didn't think it was very much, but he let his SecDef keep talking. If he knew the man, the punchline was coming. We need to drop the hammer on these riots before social media eats our lunch. Right now we're getting just a little taste of the chaos that's on deck. Wait till those blackouts hit the big cities of the Midwest and the East. The race baiters are going to lose their minds. Our troops need to roll now. When the droopy pant gangbangers wake up from their night of looting and partying, they need to see Humvees with belt-fed machine guns outside their windows. Either we do that or tonight's going to be hellfire. Sam hadn't said anything that surprised Dutch. His SecDef had let his inner bigot fly, if only a little bit. Sam had been ideologically primed to blame the decline of America on racial minorities and inner-city criminals. For his part, Dutch sensed that American moral decay went a lot deeper than gangbanger criminals and welfare mamas. But a lot of what Sam said about race riots resonated with Dutch. He couldn't deny the threat of toxic ideas. Even so, Dutch preferred to let this play without taking military action. Sam Greeny was right. Something needed to be done immediately, or the power failures from the cyber attacks would cause social unrest to skyrocket. But it was Dutch's job to find a third way, a middle course that would stop short of ordering Americans to point guns at Americans. Okay, let's take a sanity break and meet here in 15 minutes. Bring Zach in. I'm guessing there'll be some legal issues, and he's going to insist on having a say. Chapter 6. It never ceased to amaze Dutch how Sharon could compartmentalize stress. While he'd been dealing with an existential threat to the United States, his wife, daughter, and son had been looking through old photo albums back in the guest section of Air Force One. Sharon must have grabbed the albums when their Secret Service detail scooped them up for emergency transport to Andrews. Sharon always took the long view for the family. If the country was going to be nuked, she damn well wasn't going to lose the photo albums. "Daddy, I didn't know you were a mountain man." Abby gleamed at her father. "That's overstating things a bit, honey." Dutch rested his hand on the back of her auburn hair, taking emotional refuge in her youth and beauty. He and Sharon had gotten a late start on parenting, both getting through college, grad school, and a good chunk of their careers before beginning their family. During the married without children time, Sharon earned her degree in clinical psychology, which had unexpectedly become a secret weapon during Dutch's career in politics. "Your father spent several summers working as a hiking guide for an outfitter out of Lone Pine, California, the gateway to the California High Sierras. All summer long, he'd hike people up the highest peak in the continental United States, Mount Whitney." Sharon smiled at Dutch, no doubt remembering the summer they first met on one of those hikes. By the look in her eyes, he was 99% sure they were both thinking about the same hammock, a bit off the same hiking trail, on the same cool summer day in the Grouse Creek drainage. It was a minor miracle they were both virgins when they married 2 years later. "Dang, Daddy, you were a babe," Abby said, a little too loud. Several of the Secret Service men chuckled in the row behind the first family. "My dad made me take that summer job. He thought I was growing up a little too privileged. He said that no son of his would be raised with a silver spoon in his mouth." "Hey, that's the same thing you said to me," Teddy chided, softly punching the President of the United States in the shoulder. "I said that because my dad was right. Who knows how it would have turned out if it weren't for that summer job. Sometimes that's what it takes to become a man. The school of hard knocks teaches you some things you can't learn any other way." Dutch couldn't help but insert a bit of parenting agenda into the conversation. He'd been trying to talk his son into joining the Marine Corps for 2 years. Instead, Teddy meandered his way through his undergrad, studying French at Boston University. "Well, there are many ways to get there," Sharon tempered. "Grandpa Chuck preferred the gritty cowboy path, which is probably why they still live on a ranch." "So you rebelled against the mountain life, Dad?" Teddy counter-argued. "You moved to the East, went to Princeton, and became a Boston man? Everyone thinks you were born and bred in Massachusetts." Dutch stepped back and rested his hand on Teddy's shoulder. "But I've got the gravel trails of the California High Sierras in my soul, buddy. Enjoy the photos. Don't miss the one where I got my shirt off. Your old man once had a six-pack." Dutch threw a quick jab that became a feather slap on the side of Teddy's head. I love you guys. Sam Greeny came marching down the hallway toward Dutch and his family, pushing shock waves of urgency ahead of him. Dutch, the Saudis just buried the Iranians in a massive airstrike, probably reacting to the dirty nuke against their pumping station. The Iranians are mounting what retaliation they can. So far, no one's hit Israel, but things are heading that direction. Dutch put his hands on his hips and stared out the tiny window, searching for answers in the clouds. He took a deep breath and followed Sam Greeny towards the communication center. Chapter 7. Dutch, you can't use federal troops in American cities. They're mostly protests. With the possible exception of L.A., you don't have legal justification. Zach Jackson stepped back from the president's desk with his hands on his hips. President Bush and Congress modified the Insurrection Act to allow the president to call in federal troops to fight terrorism in the United States, but that entire amendment was repealed in 2008. Gone, like it never existed. And there's no way to get Congress to pass something like that on the time frame you need. The House and Senate are tossed to the four corners of the earth right now. Can't you use state guard to contain the protests? We've already seen what happened in California with guardsmen, Sam Greeny argued, wiping his face with the handkerchief he kept tucked in his pocket. They've been totally combat ineffective. They can't even get their weekend warriors to report, much less execute on a coordinated mission. But not all states will be as uneven as California, Dutch pointed out. Sure, Greeny chimed in. Some states have crackerjack guard units, and they might slam the door on rioters in those states, but what about the others? Social media shows up in every corner of the nation. Those people, the ones we're fighting here, have real-time coordination. We need to take control of this situation and stamp it out everywhere all at once. We can't abide half-assed solutions, and it's got to happen tonight. Federal troops are the only force with the command and control we need. Silence descended as Dutch thought it through. A year from now, when the urgency and fear of this day was just a vague memory, he would be called upon to answer for this decision. He'd seen it happen after 9/11. The nation had galvanized and taken action after the tragedy, but the unity didn't last forever. Things returned to normal. People forgot. Congress returned to its aisles. At some point in the future, accountability would be measured out, especially when the Democrats had some time to think it through. If he broke the law now, it would end his career and taint his legacy. I need you to find me a way, Zach, Dutch weighed in. I think it'd be unrealistic to trust the people or even the states to clean up this mess on their own. The job falls to us. We're the ones who hold the levers of the greatest political and military force in the history of the world. We can make this turn our way. Unless we employ the right amount of force in the right places, things could spiral out of control. Let's get to work. I need legal justification to send troops into our cities, and I need it now. Chapter 8. As the day wore on aboard Air Force One, reports of the outages on the East Coast rolled in like a biblical plague. Some technologically savvy staffer set up an electronic map of the U.S. on the big screen in the conference room, and the power outages burned black holes in the otherwise chestnut map. Orange County, Los Angeles, and San Diego were dark. Initially, it had been the Delta, Utah power plant that had caused the outage. But now civil disorder in Southern California raged unchecked, and power failures were occurring due to violence, absenteeism, and destruction of public works. The only good news was that blackouts weren't Southern California's biggest problem anymore. The mass exodus out of the region created a much bigger problem, and it wouldn't matter now if the power came back on or not. The blackouts east of the Mississippi were bumbling around the map like a dog who'd stolen too many rum balls. Depending on the power engineering software used in any given part of the grid and the state of maintenance of that software, the virus made more or less headway against security countermeasures. Power companies employed a perplexing array of software solutions: DigSilent, SKM, ERAX, SIME, ETAP, RSCAD, and PSSE, just to name a few. The virus penetrated software like a Lothario working a singles bar. First it would try a pickup line, then buy drinks, next hit on the ugly friend. Eventually the virus got into everyone's pants. Cincinnati and the surrounding areas were almost entirely spared thus far. Baltimore and D.C. had gone entirely dark. The Carolinas and Georgia were experiencing rolling brownouts. In Indianapolis, they couldn't even connect with cell phones. Everything had gone down. That made Dutch think about his in-laws. Sharon's parents lived in Indianapolis in a posh retirement community 20 minutes outside the big city. The president got up from his chair and walked back to his family. "Sharon, have you had contact with your folks?" She looked up from the paperback novel she was reading. His wife loved thrillers, this one with a shadowy figure with a pistol on the cover. "No, I didn't think we could call out on our phones during a warflight exercise. At least that's what they told us in the briefing. I'm pretty sure you can connect on the comm center upstairs. They'll manage the security. Go call your folks. I'm worried." "Is there a problem?" Sharon put down her book and unbuckled her seatbelt. "The blackouts are hitting Indianapolis pretty hard. Let's see if their cell phones work. They're not getting connectivity within the city. Maybe Indianapolis didn't have as good a battery backup system, or maybe the virus got into the cell networks." Dutch and Sharon walked forward together towards the stairs at the front of the plane. "What about your mom and dad in Bishop? Are you concerned with what's happening in California?" Somebody had been keeping Sharon briefed, Dutch noted. "The town of Bishop's a hell of a long ways off the beaten path. I'm sure they're getting some refugees up the backside of the Sierras, but I'd hate to be the guy who pushed his luck with my old man." "Still, I'll go ahead and call them too." Dutch and Sharon arrived at the staircase, and Sharon climbed toward the comm center, while Dutch continued on to the Oval Office. Chapter 9. "I think I found a way to justify troops," Zach Jackson announced, "but I can't guarantee it'll keep us out of trouble when Congress resumes. Protests are not the same as riots, and we've never seen a president respond to civil disorder with troops in every major city. We could potentially be prosecuted." Like all lawyers, Zach generally couched things in terms of absurd future risk. Never had a president been incarcerated for a crime. "Go on," Dutch nodded to his attorney general. "We can take two approaches. The Obama administration passed this bit of language where we can claim that there's a threat of radiological weapons being used against major U.S. cities. We don't have any evidence of a threat other than the L.A. bomb, but that's a carve-out from Posse Comitatus, and we can use it. It's weak, but if we can combine it with the stated purpose of the Insurrection Act to prevent national rebellion, we could buy ourselves some wiggle room. It's not entirely without precedent. They used the same logic to send in Army and Marines during the D.C. riots in '68 and the L.A. riots in '92. We don't have widespread riots to back us up, but hopefully by the time troops are in position, you'll have the riots you need." "Jesus, Zach, I'm hoping to stop riots, not use them." "Then I don't know what to tell you. If you stop the riots before they happen, then our legal justification evaporates." "What about the looting last night?" Dutch challenged. "It helps, but it wasn't enough to trigger states to call up guard units outside of California. It's a huge stretch to call them riots, especially when they're protesting racially biased utility access. And I assume you'll be sending troops into other cities that have no rioting at all. To my knowledge, we don't have an invite from any governor or mayor other than California's." The Attorney General held out his hands. "That's all I've got. There's non-inconsequential legal risk here, Dutch." "Thank you, Zach. What are our next steps?" "I need to draw up a request for Sam to send troops to intercept nuclear devices that we both know don't exist. Unfortunately, I'll have to sign the request myself, so it looks like you and I are in this together." "Well," the president joked, "if we wind up in prison, I'll let you have the bottom bunk. How's that sound?" "That doesn't sound funny, Mr. President." Sam Greeny knocked on the door and walked into the awkward pause in the conversation. "What's the news? Are we rolling tanks or not?" Sam challenged, oblivious to the tension in the room. Dutch tried to clear his mind, flipping back to a montage 3 years earlier as he stumped along the campaign trail across the American South. He imagined the cities waking up one by one as the sun rose across the country. Charleston, Atlanta, Montgomery, Baton Rouge, Houston. He pictured the young punks sleeping off a night of mischief in their beds, still living under their mothers' roofs in crowded, low-income housing. He pictured the single moms, alone in their mass-built duplexes on the fringes of the cities, wondering when the electricity would return. He thought about African-American children, frightened at the kitchen table, staring at a box of cereal, tuned to their parents' concern. He saw the retired pastor he'd met in New Orleans, his wife having just passed away. Dutch saw him wake up in his tiny urban home, flip the light switch, and furrow his brow as nothing happened. Dutch tried to take in all of America at once, 325 million people, and he weighed their fear, their vulnerability, and their trust in him. Most of them didn't understand the law or the Constitution. What they understood was food, water, and electricity. They knew when their house was too hot or too cold. They knew when a flood, a fire, or an invisible blanket of fallout threatened their children. Those Americans could no longer care for themselves with the lights out, except in small pockets of hardy folk like his mom and dad. Most would expect the government to care for them. And right now, Dutch was the government. They would want him to take command of the situation, regardless of the law. Sam, send the army into every city over 100,000 people. Send them armed, but I want a total weapons lockdown. This is a show of force, nothing more. Please do it now. Yes, sir. Sam Greeny set his coffee mug on Dutch's desk and walked out of the Oval Office. Chapter 10. As Dutch contemplated the decision he had just made, alone in his office, a gentle knock on the door broke his reverie. Come in, Sharon. You okay, Dutch? You look shaken. And you need a shower. Sharon smiled. It amazed Dutch how Sharon still took his breath away. The only person who would tell the President of the United States that he needed a shower. Sharon moved through the world like a gentle storm, lightly refreshing the land, but capable of bringing focused destruction when necessary. Somehow she'd taken a moment to freshen up, which meant she looked like $1,000,000, despite being on an emergency war flight on Air Force One. Even in her mid-60s, Sharon kept her hair long and colored in the fashion of the day. Right now she wore it slightly platinum blonde with a darker shade at the roots. Dutch had no idea what to call the coloring, but he saw it on younger women in the political circles of power. Sharon had maintained an excellent figure, especially considering the natural drift of age. She filled the role of First Lady with impeccable poise and decorum, and everyone in the belt loop figured her for a beautiful political wife with a decorous professional degree buried in her long-forgotten past. Very few knew that Sharon was nobody to fuck with. Her indomitable will was a weapon she kept in her psychologist's toolbox, rarely bringing it into the light of day. Hey, babe, how are your parents? Dutch stood and maneuvered her over to the couch so they could sit together. They're not answering their phones. The communications officer said that nobody in that region is connecting via anything other than satellite phone. They're beginning to think that the cyber attack included a hit on the older cellular networks. Dutch took a deep breath and lifted Sharon's hand. And my mom and dad, are they good? They're not answering either. I tried the home phone and both their cells. That's strange, Dutch worried aloud. I can't imagine where else they'd be. Sam Greeny was up in comms when I made the calls. He offered to send troops to check on both our parents. Dutch, are you sending troops into the cities? They're going in on weapons hold. We're launching a show of force to tamp down looting and rioting. Sharon pursed her lips. Weapons hold. Sounds like something Sam talked you into. Dutch gritted his teeth. He rankled a little when Sharon second-guessed him like that, even if no one was listening. It made him sound like a puppet, and he was nobody's puppet. It was my call and my call alone. Activists on social media are claiming that the power outages are a calculated act of oppression against the racial minorities. Rioting tonight could get out of control. And the people are believing it? That the blackouts are intentional? Not quite. The activists are saying that available power is being channeled to white neighborhoods and away from low-income areas. You should tell the nation it's a cyber attack. Good idea. Actually, it's a great idea. We've been hoping the power outages would be less severe and that we could write them off as too many air conditioners running at the same time. If Americans hear we're under attack, they're likely to come together and stop burning their cities. Sharon didn't look entirely convinced. We'll see. I hope it was okay with you that I let Sam send troops to our parents' homes. I know how much you hate special treatment. That made Dutch think about the tracksuit and the extra clothes stored in the closets and drawers in the executive suite on Air Force One. He wondered what had happened to the clothing of previous presidents. Peril loomed over America, and Dutch worried about wasted resources. We just need to get through tonight and everything should be okay. Again, Sharon made that face, the one where her eyes glazed over in thought, her cheeks going a little slack. What? Dutch asked. I'm just thinking about what you said concerning the social media rumors and electricity. That can't possibly be true, can it? Dutch harumphed. Not hardly. The only thing less likely than the power companies coordinating to screw the minorities would be the power companies coordinating to protect their own damn computer systems. Doing anything in this beast of a system takes about 50 times more effort and luck than anyone would imagine. I can't even get FEMA to move their asses into a nuclear strike zone in a timely manner, and I'm the damn president. There is no chance that the power companies are being cute. They have no motive, for one thing. Sharon held out a hand to Dutch. Right. But how is it that people have become so jaded and quick to assign malicious intent? Life's been pretty amazing for the past 50 years, hasn't it? Why do people turn to believing the worst in one another so quickly? Dutch held Sharon's thin hands like a lifeline. Even 30 years ago, I think I could have predicted how Americans would react to a crisis like this. Something changed, and now I'm not so sure. So many times in our history, when the chips were down, Americans have come together and defeated evil. We're facing one of those times again, Sharon, and it came on our watch. And this time, when the Lord takes the measure of our virtue, I'm no longer sure where America will stand. Chapter 11. What am I looking at? Dutch asked Sam Greeny as he stared at the LCD screen in the conference room of Air Force One. Dutch and Sam sat at the polished mahogany conference table. I've had the tech geek overlay the map of troop deployments against our map of power outages. The troops are orange and the blackouts are black. Looks like Halloween, Dutch observed. Why are the orange spots all just dots? We're still in the process of issuing orders and mobilizing forces, sir. Most of the troops haven't left base yet. Doesn't look like any of them have left base. How long since they received orders? Some of them in the last hour. The Secretary of Defense looked at his watch. Some of them? Dutch asked. Orders pass through channels, sir, especially with something this unconventional, Sam explained. What aren't you telling me, Sam? Some of the unit commanders are questioning the orders, seeking confirmation they're actually supposed to march on U.S. cities. We're not asking them to shoot civilians, Dutch emphasized, his hands clenching. How many officers are questioning our orders? That's hard to say. Most of them at first. But we need to give this a little time, Dutch. I'm sorting through those who will and those who won't take orders, and making changes where they're needed. What does making changes mean, Sam? Are you firing officers who object to our orders? Dutch knew the answer already. The situation had grown hairier than anticipated, and it had only taken a couple of hours. Sam's face flushed red. Some men never did take well to following other men, Dutch reminded himself. Sam didn't answer Dutch's question, which was answer enough. Dutch stood. Sam, I want to be clear on this. If an officer objects to my orders on constitutional or legal grounds, he is not to be reprimanded or his career tarnished, not in any way. Are we in agreement? Mr. President, the SecDef exhaled, gathering a head of steam. Sam Greeny began to raise his voice. I need you to understand this, Dutch, in no uncertain terms. If we do not enforce your orders with swift action, we cannot expect to complete this mission. And should I remind you that the mission is to save the United States? Do you think I don't know that, Sam? I'm trying to put this in the context of history, about what happens a year from now when everyone's forgotten how damn scary. History, Sam interrupted, shouting. Wake up, Dutch! There won't be any fucking history if we don't shut this rioting down right fucking now. Dutch felt, rather than heard, thundering footsteps down the hall. The doors burst open, and his Secret Service detail swept the room with their Glock 17s. They didn't point their handguns at the Secretary of Defense, but they didn't point them entirely away from him either. Stand down, gentlemen, Dutch ordered, his hands held out in front of him. Everything's fine here. We're just working through some hard choices. Please return to the security section. Dutch herded the four men toward the hallway. Sam's just blowing off steam. Everything's fine, Dutch repeated. As his Secret Service men backed into the hallway, they came up against the Secretary of Defense's security detail in military kit with AR-15 rifles dangling across their stacks of rifle magazines. Two of the four Secret Service men rotated to confront the Delta operators as though they were a threat to the president. The other two kept their guns pointed in the direction of the conference room. The Secret Service had formed a circle around Dutch. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I'm ordering all of you to go back to your seats immediately. Holster those weapons, Dutch shouted. Sharon appeared, peering out from the executive suite. A handful of others from the presidential staff goosenecked into the hallway, alarmed by the ruckus. More slowly than he would have preferred, Dutch's Secret Service men returned their handguns to their shoulder holsters, yet they remained in a protective posture. Dutch physically pushed them into the hallway, stepped back into the conference room, and closed the doors behind him. On the other side of the door, he hoped everyone was ratcheting down their testosterone and returning to their seats. "Control yourself and act like a goddamn professional," Dutch seethed at Greenie. "This is no time to lose your cool." Dutch smoothed his tie. "Now how do you propose to handle objectors? I want to know exactly what you're planning to do with those officers." Chapter 12. As evening descended on the eastern seaboard, President of the United States, Nathaniel Dutch McAdams, spoke to America. His staff had debated delaying the speech until 5 p.m. on the West Coast so that more of the country could tune in. But with the power outages and the severe stock market interruptions, nobody was likely to be at work on the West Coast anyway. The stock markets hadn't been open for more than 20 minutes total that entire day, with huge sell-offs causing the protective algorithms to halt trading within minutes of opening. A new wrinkle had arisen to curse the equity markets. Considering the massive damage to California real estate, few insurance companies were safe from the threat of bankruptcy, and their stock values plummeted based on that uncertainty. Even though homeowners insurance almost never covered atomic war, it almost always covered damage from civil disorder, and that was enough to send the value of insurance shares into a tailspin. On top of regular homeowners insurance, thousands of bond issues and other forms of insurance covered corporations, buildings, and public works. Something called reinsurance covered the insurance companies from too many claims. And of course, those reinsurance mega-corporations were running for cover now as well. With Southern California quite possibly devastated, the markets for bonds, securities, and insurance were in free fall. Runs on banks had become commonplace. Although it was Wednesday, comparisons to the Black Friday of the Great Depression rang across news channels, and the media settled on the catchy but unhelpful moniker of Black Autumn to describe the sudden terrifying fall of the financial industry. Blackouts in the East rolled back and forth, not leaving the East and Midwest entirely without power, but depriving people of any confidence that the power grid would return. Dutch began to suspect that the Russian hack, if it was a Russian hack, was intentionally designed to keep them guessing. In his speech, Dutch decided to bet all his chips on honesty with the American people, and if honesty failed, he would cash in on anger. "My fellow Americans," the historic speech began. Dutch told America the whole story in so much as he knew it. He revealed everything he knew about the nuclear attack, that it had been a small bomb with few casualties, and that the radiation readings showed no appreciable risk to Los Angelinos, particularly if offshore winds held. He told America about his suspicions that Iran had been responsible for the attack on Saudi Arabia. Then Dutch told America about the cyber attack and his personal belief that a foreign nation had used a hack to capitalize on America's current misfortunes. Dutch pled for calm. He begged people to return to their homes and their jobs. More than anything, he urged law and order. Dutch addressed the question of fair power directly and assured the American people that he had personally telephoned several CEOs of power companies, and he had received their assurances that everything possible was being done to provide electrical power to all people and in all neighborhoods. Dutch laid it on the line, delivering one of the best, most authentic speeches of his career. By accounts among the staff on Air Force One, the speech bordered on heroic, and they broke into applause the moment after he signed off. More than anything, Dutch told the whole truth. Much later, as he looked back on the events of Black Autumn and on his speech, Dutch would conclude that everyone might have been better off if he had concocted a helpful lie instead. Chapter 13. "Mr. President," Sam Greenie interrupted a late dinner between husband and wife. "Yes, Sam?" Dutch wiped his mouth and steeled himself for news. "At least 17 major cities are in full-scale riot. I have troops in 11 of them and columns approaching 2 more. It didn't take long for the rioters to figure out that our men won't shoot, given that the rioters are well informed from social media. Our troops are unable to control the civil disorder. Mr. President, we need approval to go weapons-free, and we need it now, or servicemen will die. Dutch looked to Sharon, but other than her full attention, she had nothing to offer this dilemma. I'm going to need a minute to think about this, Sam. Dutch got up to move into his suite, his intention to pray. Well, you're both here, Sam hesitated. I heard back from the teams we sent to your parents' homes. Sharon, your parents weren't there. Their condo complex appears to have been evacuated en masse, and our team's trying to figure out where they went. Dutch, I don't know how else to say this, but we found your mother and father deceased in their home. I'm very sorry. Dutch sputtered. How can that be? They don't live anywhere near L.A. They're hours from the city. The town of Bishop's only 200 miles from Los Angeles, less than a tank of gas. My guys made it to your dad's ranch in a Black Hawk helicopter from China Lake in 15 minutes. The roads were packed solid, and people from Los Angeles have been picking everything clean anywhere near a highway. Looks like your dad went down fighting. I had my men return your parents' bodies to the naval weapons base nearby, awaiting your orders. Dutch reached for the edge of the table to stop the world from spinning. His mom and dad were in their 80s, and Dutch had been preparing himself to lose them for a long time, and the fact that they'd both lived into their 80s had been a blessing. Still, losing them both at once hit Dutch like a haymaker. Could you please excuse us, Sam? Of course. Sam closed the conference room doors behind him. Dutch turned to Sharon, who had a hard look in her eyes, following Sam as he left the room. Seeing his grief, she softened. Oh, Dutch, I'm so sorry. I can't believe they're gone. Doesn't make sense. I spoke with my dad last week. I'm sorry, Dutch. The couple held on to each other for a long time, letting the waves of grief wash over them. Sharon pulled back to look Dutch in the eyes. Dutch, I don't want to make this any harder than it is, but your parents have a gate and a wall. They have loyal staff. Their neighbors are country people. Your dad refused Secret Service coverage because his ranch was already so secure. Are you buying this story? Dutch blinked away the fog floating around his head. I hadn't thought about not buying Sam's story. There's no reason for him to lie. Denial is a part of grief, Sharon. Maybe. But only 2 bodies? What about the others? Your mom and dad wouldn't have been fighting alone. A lot of people care about them, and they wouldn't have left them alone with refugees marching down the highway. Dutch didn't know what to say, so he said nothing. Sharon pulled her husband to the couch and sat with him, while their dinner cooled on the conference room table. Chapter 14. Dutch gazed at the E-4B night watch through the bulletproof glass window beside his desk in the Oval Office. It was just past 11 p.m. Eastern Time, and his staff had left him alone for an hour, no doubt giving him time to grieve his father and mother. While Americans on the ground ran in fear from rioting, looting, and fresh terrors, Dutch was left to grieve his 87-year-old father and mother. How many lives would this grieving cost? How many would die while the president got his personal shit together and headed back to business? The night watch plane blinked its mindless wingtip code of red and green. It looked like it was just off the wing of Air Force One, but Dutch knew that aeronautical distances were deceiving. The companion plane was probably more than a mile away. Dutch understood Sharon's doubt of Sam Greeny. She never liked the man, never fully supported Dutch's decision to tap him for SecDef. In her words, Sam Greeny always thought he was the smartest guy in the room. While Sam showed outward respect for Dutch's office as president, Sharon didn't buy it. She pegged him as a climber, a man pretending to defer to the commander-in-chief as a rung in his own ladder of ambitions. Sharon had loved Dutch's mom and dad, maybe even more than Dutch loved them, and he had seen her do this before, letting emotions get out ahead of clear thinking. But Dutch could hardly blame her. The nation had plummeted into a downward spiral, and all Dutch could do was dwell on his personal grief. Who was he to judge Sharon's emotional bias against Sam Greeny? Robbie, are you up? Dutch hit the intercom on his desk and called back to the staff area. Yes, sir, Robbie answered, sounding like he hadn't slept in days. Please grab Janice and anyone else you need, and let's get to work. I'd like a briefing on the rioting and the impact of the speech. Nothing fancy. Yes, sir, we'll join you in the Oval Office in 5 minutes. Getting back to work satisfied his grief like 4 fingers of bourbon. He'd feel better for a little while, but there'd be hell to pay come 3 o'clock in the morning. In 5 minutes, Robbie LaForth and Janice Foster sat in the Oval Office, and Robbie began his brief. Mr. President, I tried to gather response data from your speech tonight. Thought it was an amazing speech, by the way. Truly one of the great speeches of all time. But the polling firms have gone offline, and half the people called in sick from our NSA Signals and Intelligence Group, which might not have mattered since they don't do consumer polling anyway. Usually the media polls our moves, but they're either understaffed or focusing on their own ideological positions. I couldn't find any media polls relating to your speech. Basically, all I can show you is my own review of the social media reaction, which might be the most accurate, since we don't know how many people even have the ability to tune in on TV. While cell batteries hold and while cell towers continue to function, almost all media is being consumed on smartphones. Dutch nodded for him to continue. On your personal Facebook page and the White House page, you got over 1.7 million reactions, mostly likes. There were over 100,000 comments, and they expressed a lot of support overall. I did notice a substantial number of comments expressing distrust of your relationship with the electrical company CEOs, since you said you called them personally. A substantial minority of comments criticized your motives as a white patriarchal male and made unflattering comments about you having the kind of friendship with large corporations where you could call them. But I emphasized that critical comments were in the minority. And what about the reality on the ground? What impact did the speech have on civil disorder? We have reports of major rioting in 17 cities, and we expect more before the evening's through. The riots in California have intensified. I don't think we can say Los Angeles is rioting anymore, because I don't think there's a coherent police presence in most of the greater Los Angeles area. It's more like anarchy. A knock interrupted Robbie's report, and Sam Greeny stepped into the Oval Office, his face set hard like the prow of a Greek fighting ship. Dutch, we've lost our first military personnel. 3 men were just killed in hand-to-hand fighting against rioters in Detroit. He handed Dutch a piece of paper that looked like a report of some kind. It's now or never, sir, Sam prodded. Dutch didn't like being backed into a corner, but he'd learned that sometimes you played the cards you were dealt. He might never know the ultimate impact of his speech, but it seemed clear at this point that the kind of people who rioted probably weren't the kind of people who watched speeches from the White House. Order our men weapons free, Dutch said, putting the nation and his presidency in God's hands. Chapter 15. How much longer should we stay in the air, Sam? Dutch ran into Sam Greeny walking down the hallway at first light. We just mid-air refueled, and we're waiting for confirmation that the riots are under control. Going weapons hot, stop the bastards in their tracks, Dutch. Looks like we might have this licked. How many dead? The president listened intently. I'm not sure. Sounds like 200 or 300 dead in 30 cities, sir. We suffered 13 casualties among our military personnel, but I'm still waiting for reports. We are experiencing some communications difficulties. Dutch sensed something lurking beneath the words. Tell me what that means, Sam. You already know we lost a few officers over legal objections when we ordered them into American cities. I already covered most of those losses with inline promotions. Dutch pictured the kind of man who would object to his order to shoot at civilians and couldn't help feeling like he might have been among them. A couple more commanders withdrew troops to their base when we made the call to go weapons hot. I'm working on getting those officers replaced. A couple of our bases have gone radio silent. Radio silent? Dutch couldn't believe that the hardened military communication systems had been impacted by a cyber attack. Some of our bases, and also units in the field, have stopped communicating with us. Mr. President, I'm guessing that some of them are objecting to orders and others are losing cohesion of force. What does that mean? Sir, I believe we're experiencing absenteeism and desertion in some of our units, mostly admin and support. Combat troops are holding up better. Dutch imagined how servicemen and women might feel about the power outages, the nuclear attack, the riots, and the stock market crash. Many would have a strong desire to rally around their families rather than stay at their jobs. The ragged truth, their duty to family might be stronger than their oath to the country. Dutch could understand that feeling, especially today, with his father's body lying on concrete in an airplane hangar somewhere in the California desert. At some point, family would become everything, regardless of oaths. Why are we still in the air? We're seeing no missile launches, no ground forces, no planes threatening our airspace. Why aren't I on the ground talking to these officers personally?" Sam paused and scratched his stubble. "Sir, we're seeing a statistically manageable attrition rate in our forces. It's not like we need 100% force to put down civilian riots. It's not as though they're armed with RPGs. You're missing the point. We're getting these cities under control. Please come look at the battle screen and you'll see what I mean." They moved from the hallway to the conference room. The big screen TV looked like Christmas and Halloween had been thrown in a blender and tossed on a map of the United States. "I know the black areas are blackouts and the orange areas are troop concentrations. What are the red and green areas?" Dutch asked. "Red areas are active civil disorder and green areas are pacified." Sam pointed to Detroit, which was still red with an orange blob at the periphery. Then he pointed to Atlanta, which was black with a green blob in the center. "We've pacified Atlanta, but we haven't pacified Detroit yet. There's a combined force of Michigan State Guard and regular Army from Fort Custer closing in on Detroit now. The jammed roads are slowing them down, but we expect they'll reach the city soon. Well, I can see why we're still in the air." Dutch tapped the screen over the Washington, D.C. area, a large red blot without any orange or green inside. "The cyber attack seems to be hitting the area around D.C. particularly hard. Richmond's been dark for 36 hours, and our forces at Fort Lee are entirely occupied with citywide civil disorder there. To the north of D.C., Baltimore's an absolute shit show. Andrews and the White House are hemmed in by 4 hotspots, and the roads are blocked. The Marine Corps barracks at 8th and I have barricaded themselves in, and they're waiting for mechanized support. Sir, we cannot land back in D.C. until we make some substantial progress in that area. Please walk me through the situation on the ground in D.C. I need to understand what's happening." "I'm not sure D.C. is a good example, Dutch. We had an asymmetrical reaction to our peacekeeping forces in some cities, including D.C. Marines from Quantico immediately responded to my call to move on the White House, but they were on weapons hold, so they couldn't do much more than look nasty. Here's where it gets weird. They were driven back to their beachhead by a coordinated force of armed civilians, gangbangers, they thought. The Marines took a lot of incoming fire." "What do you mean by a coordinated force of civilians?" Dutch tried to picture it, gangbangers squaring off against Marines, and he couldn't. "The Marine ground commander said that civilians were maneuvering on the Marines in a coordinated fashion, flanking their forces and trying to cut off their avenue of retreat. His exact words were that the civilians, urban irregulars he called them, fought like Chechen Muslims in Iraq." "Wait, he said they were Chechens, Russians?" Dutch interrupted. "No, he thinks they were gangbangers. He later compared them to trained fighters. Chechens in Iraq were trained by the Russian military before becoming Islamic terrorists. In other words, the Marine ground commander thought that these gangster guys maneuvered like trained warfighters." "Were enemy troops inserted into D.C.? Dutch's worldview threatened to take a precarious turn. Sam shook his head. "I don't think so. We're working a few theories. In any case, the Marines will crush them now that their weapon's hot." "Tell me about the theories." "Nothing substantial. The CIA had a few uncorroborated reports of military-age males from the gang population engaging in militia-like training in the woods of Virginia. We wrote it off as urban legend. Maybe we were wrong. Maybe some Mexican cartel was preparing to take advantage of civil disorder. The only entities we can think of who might do that would be the cartels or the Russians, or maybe both." "That's insane, Sam. Now you're sounding like one of those alt-right talk show hosts. I know you have a bit of a burr under your saddle about the blacks and Hispanics, but you don't actually believe this, do you?" Sam Greeny shrugged. "Is anything really beyond the realm of possibility right now? Strange came out of the woodworks last night. Some smart criminal or maybe a rogue nation prepared for this. It's just a few hotspots in a few cities, but some of the gangbangers are more than just pissed-off criminals. They're insurgents, and social media isn't doing us any favors. They're recruiting much faster than we are. Until we're talking about more than just a couple of firefights, let's put these theories on ice, Sam." Dutch didn't like his SecDef's worldview. The president had entered the zone of regret when it came to sharing leadership with Sam Greeny. Dutch reluctantly admitted to himself that he may have taken the team of rivals thing too far. He'd imitated the personal leadership style of Abraham Lincoln by building a cabinet of bull-headed critics and devil's advocates. It had played well for Dutch, but that didn't mean the strategy was bulletproof. His misgivings about Sam Greeny churned in his gut like last night's Thai food. The racism thing was coloring Sam's judgment, but that didn't necessarily mean Sam was wrong. It did mean he was insecure, though, and insecure people with power could be dangerous. The conundrum wasn't worth pursuing. They had bigger problems than Sam's daddy issues, or whatever they were. There are a lot more troops around D.C. than just the Marines from Quantico. What are we doing to take our capital back? Sam stepped up to the map as though to show troop movements, but the scale was too large. Still, Sam pointed at Washington, D.C., a red blob that bled into the red blobs of Baltimore and Richmond. There aren't as many combat troops as you might think near D.C., sir. We're tapping some ceremonial and administrative units, but they're still soldiers and Marines. 1st Battalion, 3rd Infantry is moving out of Fort Myer to form a cordon to the south of the capital and expand the zone of control southward toward Richmond. Mechanized and MP units out of Fort Bragg are en route, but they're experiencing delays due to massive traffic jams. When they get to D.C., they'll set up a blocking force to the north, facing Baltimore. 91st Engineer Battalion from Belvoir was split in two and helped the battalions from Myer and Meade clear roads north and south, enforcing a growing area of order. They need to clear Highway 1 into D.C. first. That'll take a day, maybe two. Our ground units at Andrews are going to expand out from the base, linking up with the Marines and the D.C. Guard to create a protected corridor back to the capital. The Marines at Quantico will serve as shock troops for the D.C. Guard in taking back the streets of D.C. We've called up the Virginia Guard, and they'll be joining with the strikers at Fort Pickett to clear 95 toward Bragg. We'd like to get the 7th Transport Group from Fort Eustis in the game, but we're having trouble reaching their commander. Either he's tied up with civil disorder in Richmond, or they're intentionally not returning our calls. Take your pick. When can we land? Dutch asked again. I'm not sure that's a good idea, sir. There's no major command and control base with a big enough airstrip where I can guarantee your safety. If you land, it might generate a surge of protest among civilians. Men could die defending you. Virtually all major air bases are near population centers. I need more time to pick the right base and to create a buffer zone around it. Dutch wanted to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Landing in a new base might exacerbate that problem. Maybe he was more useful in the air, as miserable as it was. I'd like to land as soon as we have a reasonably secure landing area, somewhere I can take command and de-escalate the situation from the ground. In the meantime, what are we doing to get our stock market under control? That would be a question for Secretary Avenel. Last contact we had with him was 10 hours ago in D.C. Dutch looked at D.C. on his television screen, a red area with tentacles reaching toward Richmond, Baltimore, and even Frederick, Maryland, with the Secretary of the Treasury buried somewhere in the middle. Let's reach out to the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, then. Thank you, Sam. No problem, sir. We'll win this. Things are looking good. Troops are on the move, and they're making a difference, Sam Greeny again promised. We have over 400,000 combat troops in country, and no sane civilian throws rocks at a Stryker armored fighting vehicle. Chapter 16. Like a nervous suitor at a father's door, Air Force One circled over the heartland of the United States, unable to return to D.C. and unwilling to give up its mission. 7 days after the crash of the stock market, the president and his retinue still hadn't touched ground. Dutch had received 3 military briefings each day for the last 7 days, and he had come to know the feeling of Thor, unable to lift his hammer. Launching troops from their bases had triggered an entirely unexpected effect. Civilian truck drivers drove home and stayed there. Such a devilishly forgettable factor. Uncomplicated men with a demanding job and significant autonomy. Truck drivers had no reason to risk themselves or their trucks in the midst of riots, during a military show of force. The Los Angeles riots of 1992 had demonstrated the foolishness of a truck driver entering a city while it rioted. Reginald Denny had been dragged from his semi-truck cab and beaten while news cameras filmed overhead, which forever burned one simple truth into the minds of truck drivers. There are no medals pinned to the chest for delivering product during a riot, only potential beatings. While Sam Greeny battled the current war, civil disorder from rolling blackouts, the next war slipped in under their noses. Within days, they faced catastrophic food shortages. Rioters were no longer hapless teenagers and opportunistic gangbangers. Now their mothers and grandmothers lined up to shout at the Army and National Guard troops. Rioting had gone mainstream. What had once been demonstrations in 100 metropolises became civil unrest in nearly every city over 10,000 people. 100 riots became 2,600 riots within 48 hours of sending troops into the big cities. Regular Americans could abide a power outage during early fall. What they could not abide was hunger. The sheer size of the United States contributed to Dutch's defeat. 400,000 combat troops sounded like a massive number, enough to defeat any army in the world. But helicopter gunships and Tomahawk cruise missiles don't stop angry fathers and mothers, and troops on the ground can't be everywhere at once. In squads of 30, 400,000 troops can only hold 13,000 street corners in 2,600 cities. If each city has 100 such street corners, then infantry can only cover 5% of a city, while desperate urbanites loot out the other 95%. Panic-stricken Americans didn't need to defeat soldiers in order to steal supplies. They only needed to move over to the next block. Before the collapse, when doomsayers talked about grocery stores only having food for 3 days, they hadn't factored in hoarding. The moment blackouts extended past a couple of hours, people raced to the markets and vaporized everything remotely edible. Stores that attempted to lock their doors were broken down and overrun. People who came late for the frenzy went crazy with fear, committing criminal acts of petty violence and theft that would have been inconceivable a week earlier. The specter of empty shelves drove good people into a very bad place, and the panic devolved with each passing day, going from bad to apocalyptic. Sam Greene wasn't coming entirely clean about the state of the troops. Dutch had set up a back-channel communication with 3 Army generals, friends from college. In a half-dozen satellite phone conversations, Dutch garnered the truth, that absenteeism in the troops had skyrocketed. The 400,000 American combat troops had declined to something approximating half that number. Especially among National Guard units, men and women returned to their families rather than guard street corners while they watched their own cities burn. Robbie LaForth, the president's chief of staff, sat in the Oval Office on Air Force One, and Dutch could smell him. Robbie looked like shit. While the president and first lady had a suite full of clothing, Robbie hadn't had a chance to grab more than the one suit he was wearing. "What's the shower situation, Robbie?" "I'm sorry, sir, but we're on severe rationing, and the flight crew's allowing only 1 shower per 4 days. I know I must look and smell awful." Robbie had been an exceedingly loyal chief of staff, and somehow seeing his friend wrinkled and oily brought the nation's predicament all the way home for Dutch. Millions were suffering hunger and violence miles below the gleaming airship. The thought hung on Dutch like a clouded nightmare, a memory of some almost forgotten sin. But his dirty assistant could not be denied, and he nearly brought tears to Dutch's eyes. "You know, Robbie, you're a good man. I don't think I ever thanked you for your service to this country." Dutch choked up. "Thank you, sir. It's an honor, particularly to serve you." Dutch waved away the compliment. "What's the latest news on your family?" "Thank you for asking. Michelle and Regina are with my parents in Maine. Haven't heard from him in 2 days. The cell towers must have stopped working in that part of the state. As you know, Jeremy's stationed in Germany. I got through to him and he said something about Muslim immigrants causing trouble in Stuttgart." Dutch furrowed his brows. Unchecked European immigration had been a ticking time bomb, and he could easily see Muslims rising from the civil disorder as an organized threat. Hopefully he was wrong. Boom! Snap! Dutch heard a massive bang, something he'd never heard before on an aircraft. He rushed into the hall and headed aft, where he could now hear screams and shouting. As Dutch rounded the corner of the conference room, he ran into 2 Secret Service agents who immediately threw him against the bulkhead and placed their backs to his, pinning him to the wall. The shouting receded, and the screams turned to sobs. Dutch squirmed underneath the weight of the Secret Service men and worked his way out between them enough to capture the scene in the office staff section of the plane. Once again, the Secret Service men and the protective detail for the Secretary of Defense were pointing guns at one another. A man in a business suit lay face down on the cabin floor, a huge burgundy pool beneath his head. Dutch's daughter Abigail stood hiding in Sharon's arms, weeping uncontrollably. "Abby, are you okay?" Dutch shouted over the din. "Yes, Daddy, I'm fine. I'll be okay," she sobbed, then pitched into a fit of coughing. "What happened?" Dutch demanded of the Secret Service man still pinning him to the wall. Daniel Brooks, he recalled, the chief of his detail. "Sir, the man on the ground grabbed your daughter and threatened her with a knife from the galley unless we landed the plane in D.C. We refrained from shooting so as not to risk the integrity of the airframe, as we're trained, sir. This cowboy, sir, he took a shot with his M4. The Secret Service man pointed his chin at a Delta operator from the SecDef's detail. "Okay, relax, everyone." Dutch pushed his way from behind the agents and addressed the operator who had killed his daughter's assailant. "What's your story?" "No story, sir. I had the guaranteed shot from behind the man and I took it. I'm shooting frangible ammo, so there was zero chance my round would compromise the aircraft after passing through his skull." "What is frangible ammo?" Dutch demanded. "Powdered metal compressed into a slug. It breaks up when it hits a hard target. There was little risk of overpenetration and I had the shot point blank." Dutch looked opposite where the man had apparently fired and could see a number of gray impact marks on the fuselage and bulkhead, along with a constellation of pink spackle. Dutch turned to his wife and daughter and shepherded them back toward their suite at the front of the plane, wrapping his arms around them as they walked. His son Teddy followed. As he herded his family away from the specter of death, he remembered the words of his father when Dutch called him late at night on the West Coast to tell him he'd won the election to the presidency of the United States. His father's words had knocked Dutch off kilter and had haunted him as he worked long hours as leader of the free world. "Congratulations, son. Just don't forget you'll be president for 4 years, but you will be a father and a husband forever." Dutch ground his teeth as the words echoed in his soul, his daughter weeping hysterically, and Sharon's arms wrapped around her like a shawl. The ghost of his dad, apparently, had found him at 30,000 feet above America. Chapter 17. Robbie LaForth, Zach Jackson, Sharon McAdams, and the president sat in the Oval Office. Sam Greeny hadn't been invited. Late afternoon light cut through the windows, projecting fake rainbows on the plastic walls of the seat of power of the United States of America, or what was left of it. "I have one question, and I need it to stay in this office. Why were Sam's men armed with frangible ammunition? I can only think of one reason, and it isn't good. I'm hoping the three of you can think of alternative explanations." Dutch's Attorney General seemed to connect the dots before anyone else in the room. "You don't think Sam had something to do with the attack on the United States, do you, Dutch? I mean, he's an asshole, but a traitor? I can't believe that." "I don't get it," Sharon said. "Why does having frangible bullets mean that Sam Greeny was in league with the cyber attack?" "Maybe it doesn't," Robbie replied. "Maybe he just came on board ready for violence." "Back up." Sharon held out her hands in a stopping motion. "What am I missing?" Dutch explained. "There's only one good reason to come loaded with ammunition that shatters on impact, and that's to be ready to shoot on the airplane. Not even the Secret Service was loaded for a shooting incident inside the fuselage." Sharon slumped back on the sofa, thinking. "And who was that guy, the one who grabbed my daughter?" Dutch asked as the silence stretched out. "His name was Paul. He's one of my legal staff." Zach Jackson, the Attorney General, exhaled. He hadn't heard from his family in D.C. in 4 days, and his stock portfolio had been completely wiped out by the first wave of sell-offs. He also didn't have a chance to bring his antidepressants on board. I made him come with me even though he objected. I think all this is my fault." Dutch shook his head. When it comes to mental instability, it's hard to assign blame. "How's everybody else on the plane doing? Paul probably wasn't the only one in a bad way." Nobody answered, probably because everyone was feeling the stress, including each of the 4 in the Oval Office. Being cooped up in a beautiful, custom-built flying hotel could feel like a prison, and everybody aboard had come to know that unexpected truth. "We need to get on the ground and empty this airplane," Sharon stated. "Things are going from bad to worse in terms of mental health. Plus, if Sam Greeny is an actual threat, then we need to tie a rope around that threat." Chapter 18. As Air Force One descended toward Omaha, Nebraska, Dutch broke the news to Sam Greeny. As much as he would have liked to leave the man in Omaha, he would have to justify it based on a frayed suspicion triggered by the kind of ammunition his men had brought on board. As Dutch well knew, there could be 100 plausible explanations. You're going to need to ditch your security guys at Strategic Air Command, Sam. We're getting rid of everyone on the plane except for critical personnel. If we're going to have any chance of taking this country back, we can't be toting around a plane full of non-essential people distracting us from our mission. I've seen Secret Service guys point guns at your guys and your guys point guns at them twice now. That's over. Your heavy hitters are Nebraskans now. Sam Greeny's eyes narrowed as he seemed to consider arguing the point. Then his face relaxed. Okay, Mr. President, I'll need 4 of my support guys and, of course, the comms operators if we're going to continue coordinating the military effort. Okay, Dutch agreed. Another thing, Sam. I'm going to need 2 hours on the ground to do my job as a father. How's that, Dutch? If we can't get D.C. back in our control, and if we end up making a contingency landing somewhere else, I need to know I can take care of my family. As it stands on this airplane, I don't even own a pair of jeans. Sam raised an eyebrow. You want to gather supplies for your family? You can't guarantee the success of this mission, and neither can I. At the end of the day, I'm a father. What kind of father would I be if I didn't prepare for my family's long-term options? Dutch could see the wheels turning in Sam's head. A little younger than Dutch, Sam's wife had passed away from breast cancer 10 years prior, and his son worked as a business executive in London. Sam would struggle to see things from Dutch's perspective when it came to family. Sam seemed to reach some kind of decision, and it made Dutch's shoulders tense. Okay, Dutch, I'll have a quartermaster standing by to be ready to set you up with whatever you need at SAC base. They should be able to send you off with a damn Army-Navy surplus store. That's where the doomsday preppers buy their stuff, right? Army-Navy surplus? Sam laughed, and Dutch couldn't tell if he was being ridiculed. 2 hours, Sam. I need to be a father for 2 hours. After that, I'm back to being President of the United States, and we can pull our country back from the brink. Deal? Dutch disliked the sound of himself negotiating with his Secretary of Defense. He knew himself well enough to know that his self-doubt was eating away at his personal strength. Undoubtedly, his father and mother's passing had eroded that foundation. In the end, no man could be utterly certain of his mental fortitude. Depression could get its hooks into anyone. Of course, Dutch, it's no problem. You're President of the United States. You can take as many MREs as you want, whenever you want. The intercom announced the return to seats as Air Force One lined up for a landing. Sam Greeny stood and moved toward the door. Dutch, you might want to let Robbie LaForth off at Omaha as well. He's wearing a little thin. Chapter 19. As he sped across the tarmac in a Humvee, Dutch's mind tore at the problem like a dog scratching out a hole. What could he do in the next 2 hours that would ensure his family's long-term survival? He'd already decided that he should approach the problem as though America would never come back. It was the last thing he wanted to believe, but he owed it to his family to face that reality. For starters, he would have to frankly consider the end of the American nation and all the comforts that had come with it. Not only would he have to imagine his world without modern advantages, but he would have to see it without him as president. In a desolate future, Dutch's role as leader of the free world would be a curiosity at best, a death warrant at worst. For 7 days, hanging out over America in the sky, Dutch had borne witness to tens of thousands of fires, particularly as they passed over populated areas. From horizon to horizon, the hopelessness of Americans billowed into the air like blackened fists, thrusting their impotent wrath skyward, only to dissipate in the coming jet stream of winter. 100,000 pilasters of smoke offered final judgment on modern America's city culture. They were not of a heart to redouble their efforts, tighten their belts, and proceed forward with greater humility. This was not the America of the Great Depression, where most turned to growing vegetables instead of lawns, packing families into smaller homes for warmth, and scavenging trash for reuse. In contrast, modern Americans set fire to their cities. If he were recognized as president, their indignation and blame would likely sweep his family up like rats. It made him think of black-and-white photographs of Mussolini, the Italian dictator, hanging upside down with his mistress from iron scaffolding. The thought made him glance at his driver, an Air Force supply management officer. The man stared straight ahead as he drove, wrapped in professionalism. Dutch couldn't tell if the man blamed his president for the sudden loss of his hopes and dreams. The air whipping through the Humvee blew heavy with the smell of smoke, a grim reminder of the panic and disorder that had swallowed nearby Omaha. Dutch wondered how the man must feel about helping them take resources from their base. Those same resources could have otherwise contributed to the survival of the man, his base, and maybe his family. Dutch felt an urge to ask about the man's family and almost spoke. Instead, he clamped his mouth shut. For these next 2 hours, he needed to put aside his concern for anyone other than his family and friends. For the next 2 hours, he would be a father again. Maybe too late, but better late than never. As the Humvee sped closer to the chain-link fence surrounding the airfield, Dutch reined in his thoughts. For the first time ever, he needed to focus on the animal survival of those he loved. He tapped that version of himself, almost 50 years in the past, that had lived in the hardscrabble world, a lifetime distant from when he worried about whether blue socks clashed with his charcoal slacks. Dutch would have to locate that place in his soul that once scaled Mount Whitney, the lives of his hikers utterly reliant upon his judgment. In a past life, he once concerned himself with pack weight, calories, exertion, and above all else, weather. He would take in the capabilities of those in his care and assess their strength and needs, their boots and cardiovascular fitness. He would set contingency plans to ensure survival when Murphy's Law came to call and stacked against them all the worst-case scenarios and maybe some scenario he had never considered. Dutch forced his mind to consider merciless nature and entropy, a heartless adversary who would fight his every move with random, dangerous permutations. All his education, experience, and intelligence could come down to this moment and this question. What would he pack aboard Air Force One to save his family's lives? Dutch had already decided they would not remain at Offutt Air Force Base. Earlier, as they descended from above the clouds in Air Force One, he'd seen the burning of Omaha, hundreds of fires curling black-on-black tendrils into the sky. Something in Dutch's subconscious had known that those chemical fires bespoke a greater evil, that a malevolent legion would eventually come for his family if they stayed long at Offutt. After doing all he could for his family to survive, Dutch might have to shrug off the mantle of president and go forward as any other man fighting to protect his own. Food was the first thing to come to mind, but Dutch held that thought at bay for a moment, considering the minarets of smoke over Omaha. "Guns," Dutch shouted to the driver over the howling wind on the Humvee. "Please take me to the armory." The officer nodded with a slight smile, apparently approving of Dutch's awakening. Security first. Everything else second. Chapter 20. Dutch, his son Teddy, the supply officer, and 2 Air Force security officers stood together for a moment, regarding the racks filled with modern firearms. Given the critical nature of Strategic Air Command to the defense of the United States, someone had seen fit to arm the base security forces to the teeth. Unfortunately, the array of weapons did more to confuse Dutch than inspire him. "I'm really wishing you'd taken my advice and joined the damn Marines, Teddy," Dutch said, half-jokingly. The 3 servicemen chuckled. "Sorry, Dad, I'm pretty useless in this department," Teddy apologized. "Everything I know about this stuff I learned from Call of Duty." Dutch had shotguns a lot growing up on the slopes of the California High Sierras, but his father's arsenal tilted decidedly toward cowboy-style firearms. The scores of oiled black rifles arrayed before him looked like movie props to Dutch. "If I may, sir," one of the Air Force security men spoke. Both he and the other security force officer were outfitted like Navy SEAL assaulters, camouflage fatigues, Kevlar helmets, and chest rigs with magazines, radios, and other doodads sticking out in all directions. "Please do. I would consider it a favor," Dutch said, motioning to the racks of weapons. The 3 airmen snapped to work loading up a rolling handcart for the president. They began with 6 compact assault rifles, each with a chunky holographic sight on top. The men buzzed around the armory, grabbing guns, ammunition, batteries, extra batteries, chatting it up like schoolgirls on a shopping spree at the mall. For a moment, Dutch forgot how deadly serious this exercise might be. Even with America burning, it was hard to imagine he would ever defend his life and family with military hardware. "Sir, how do you feel about this one?" One of the airmen held up a big bolt-action rifle with a hulking scope on top. If that's a Remington 700, then I think we're good to go. Dutch couldn't help but show off a little. When he was a young man, he had hunted deer in Central California with a woodstock version of the same rifle. Excellent. The airman beamed approval and loaded the rifle in the cart. This one's a 7.62, sir. I'll grab a case ammo for it, he said as he darted into another room. Finally, the supply officer brought out 3 crates full of hand grenades. Dutch held up his hands. I'm not sure grenades would make sense for us. His son shook his head, smiling in a parody of disappointment with his old dad. If I've learned one thing from hundreds of hours playing Call of Duty, it's that you never pass up on grenades. Teddy carefully took the crates from the waiting airman and loaded them into the rolling cart. I suppose that means javelin and law rockets won't be required? One of the airmen asked. No, thank you, Dutch confirmed. But I do think that night vision goggles and maybe some body armor could be helpful. Absolutely, sir. That stuff's next door. Chapter 21. Word spread that Air Force One had landed in Offutt, and Dutch's worst fears began to coalesce around the front gate to the base. The 2 security forces officers helping Dutch were pulled away to address a menacing crowd of angry civilians at the base entrance, shouting pleas and curses for their president to save them from the turmoil that had seized Omaha. Dutch had no time to agonize over their ire. He had only an hour left on the ground, and he racked his brain as to what his family might need in the months to come. Try as he might, he could not come up with a large-scale, reliable solution to providing clean water for his family. Every good option seemed tied to a piece of land. He needed a river, lake, or a well to provide water for any length of time, and he had a bad feeling about setting up near groundwater. It seemed like groundwater would attract people, and that he must stay clear of the masses at all costs. The more he thought about long-term survival, the bigger the problem loomed. Dutch felt like Alice falling down the rabbit hole, the questions becoming deeper and stranger the farther he descended. The president kicked himself for not preparing ahead of time, like setting up a ranch in Montana or a farm in a small town. He'd had the money, he just hadn't thought to make it a priority. Ultimately, Dutch admitted to himself that he couldn't conquer all the variables by raiding storerooms at Air Force bases. There were hundreds of necessary items the Air Force had no reason to stock, like solar panels, portable generators, freeze-dried food, field toilets, and family-sized tents. He would need to bet it all on some strategy of survival other than becoming frontier settlers. Setting up an entire farm like a modern-day homesteader wasn't going to be possible. Not now. In a storeroom beside the armory, Dutch and Teddy found Doom and Bloom Stomp medkits stashed away in a locker reserved for pararescue training. They rushed to the base PX and loaded up on military fatigues in their sizes: boots, socks, underwear, feminine hygiene products, and toilet paper. Dutch sped through the cosmetics section and picked up hair dye for himself and Sharon. Then he grabbed a beard trimmer, not sure if he would have electricity to even run it. In a flash of guilt, Dutch insisted on leaving his credit card with the befuddled cashier as they hurried out the door, running against the clock. They made their last stop at the Airman Survival Container and stocked up on compact water filters, one-man tents, knives in various sizes, flashlights, radios that Dutch didn't know how to use, mace, and meals ready to eat. The MREs presented a particular challenge. Dutch compared their weight with the practical limitations of airplane cargo and concluded that he had a problem. To Dutch, the meals seemed to weigh well over a pound each, and they would add up very fast. He knew he wouldn't be abandoning Robbie LaForth nor Janice Foster at Offutt Air Force Base, no matter Sam Greeny's push to get rid of the Chief of Staff. The same would go for another half-dozen of the team aboard the plane. His new family group numbered around 10 people, and that would add up to 30 MREs per day, or at least 900 pounds of MREs per month. If they were stuck in the boonies for a year, they would have to pack over 20,000 pounds of food, much more than Dutch imagined a Boeing 747-8 could carry and still get off the ground. Dutch called ahead to the pilot and asked. "Sir," the pilot replied, "we can carry 100 tons of whatever you want. 10 tons won't be a problem." Dutch jumped behind the wheel of the Humvee and sent the supply officer to track down 20 pallets of MREs and a forklift and meet him at the plane. As Dutch crossed the basics of survival off his hurried list, he returned to thinking about his long-term strategy. How could his family enter a fresh, belligerent world with a decisive advantage? How could he trade the next 15 minutes for a plan that would catapult his loved ones ahead of the curve? Dutch made a hard U-turn, bumped over the curb and onto the grass, then went back the way he had come. A Humvee going the other way slammed on his brakes to avoid a collision and gave the president a hearty middle finger out the window. "Sorry, pal," Dutch apologized out loud. His son couldn't help but laugh at the irony of an enlisted man giving his commander-in-chief the bird. "I bet he'd be horrified if he knew who you were," Teddy said. "Maybe not today. There are a lot of Americans who'd probably love to see me crucified right now." Dutch finally spoke the truth to himself and his son. No matter what happened now, and no matter how much virtue and honor he had intended, he would forever be the president who presided over the greatest horror to ever touch the United States of America. Chapter 22. Dutch and Teddy had returned to the armory, much to the shock of the enlisted man standing behind the front counter. 2 hours before, his superior officers had helped the president. Now they were tied up at the base gate practicing riot control. The young airman would have to handle the scenario by himself. Noticing the young man's discomfiture, Dutch jumped ahead of the stress he could see painted across the young man's face. "Feel free to take pictures with your phone so you're not held responsible for what happens next." The young enlisted man nodded and went to work helping Dutch and Teddy deplete the stores of weapons and ammunition. Dutch first had the young airman set aside all the firearms and ammunition he thought they might need for base defense. Then, Dutch grabbed every other weapon they could lay hands on, including belt-fed machine guns, links, grenades, cleaning kits, tactical flashlights, and every remaining case of ammunition in the building. The more he thought about it, the more Dutch figured that military firearms might be worth their weight in gold. While Dutch hadn't planned well enough to own a farm or a cattle ranch, he could do the next best thing: work for a farmer or rancher to keep land and animals out of the hands of the lawless. If the civilized world failed completely, a truck full of military weapons and ammunition could probably be traded for hundreds of acres of arable land, complete with wells, herds of beef cattle, horses, and farm equipment. Dutch knew it was a guess, but it was his best stab at getting ahead in a world where people no longer respected property rights. Even in that world, no sane person would walk into machine gun fire to steal a cow. Dutch would bring the guns, and maybe the gunmen, thinking of his Secret Service detail, and given the right rancher or farmer, he might be able to strike a mutually beneficial partnership. The idea of himself cruising the countryside as a gunman made Dutch feel like a macho fantasy fool. But he looked across the base at the smoke hanging over Omaha, and he suddenly didn't feel quite so foolish. Dutch heard the artificial click-hiss of a cell phone camera and turned to see the young airman taking shots of the president in front of the Humvee, now bristling with gun barrels, poking out in every direction. "Just so they don't think I took the guns for myself," the airman explained feebly. Dutch laughed and shook the young airman's hand. He would love to have said something presidential in that moment, but he felt more like a pirate than a president, leaving the base security with less than half their ammunition and a small percentage of their guns. Dutch hoped they would no longer need them after he took to the air and the angry crowd dispersed. "I hope I didn't leave you guys in a bad way," Dutch apologized, nodding toward the Humvee. "We're good, sir. We have more cases, ammo, and a bunker on the far side of the airfield. I'll pull together a work detail and resupply the armory as soon as you leave. Don't worry about us, sir. We'll defend our base." Dutch sighed, wondering if they really would. He doubted their fuel reserves would last more than a month, the generators running night and day. Without food shipments coming from the outside, the base would quickly burn through their stores of fresh food and MREs. While foraging on their base, Dutch estimated that Offutt had a couple hundred pallets of meals ready to eat, and those would disappear fast with almost 9,000 servicemen and women, plus dependents, relying upon them as their only source of food. No matter how strong or how prepared, everyone would suffer given the collapse of modern civilization. Even in the middle of Oklahoma, Dutch guessed that Offutt Air Force Base probably got half their food from Mexico and California, which might as well be on the dark side of the moon now that trucks weren't running. In 1,000 ways no one had contemplated since the Great Depression, modern man would be sucker-punched over and over with critical needs they had long forgotten in the comfortable haze of global shipping and Amazon Prime. Even the American military. Chapter 23. While Dutch gathered supplies, Sharon McAdams had been working through the complement and crew of Air Force One, leaving most of them at Offutt Air Force Base, and keeping only those people absolutely necessary to a recovery of the United States. Some had resisted the idea of leaving the president's side. Others had been more than happy to get off the sinking ship. One despondent man had been driven to self-destruction already. The bloodstain still hadn't been washed out of the carpet in the office section of the plane. As the plane prepared to depart, Sharon debriefed her husband in the Oval Office. "Sam Greeny showed up with 5 support men instead of the 4 you agreed to," Sharon said, her shoulders pitched forward in aggravation. Dutch sighed. He would love nothing more than to kick Sam off the plane, his resignation letter in hand. The trust between the 2 men had taken serious hits in the last few days, and it would most likely never recover, no matter how successful they were in restitching the fabric of the nation. But the trouble of replacing Sam at this point was far greater than the trouble of making their strained relationship work. Dutch owed it to America to put aside his annoyance with the man and get both their backs behind the work at hand. Restoring the broken union would require the military, and nobody understood the moving parts of the military better than Sam Greeny. It's okay, let it be. Dutch tried to assuage her concern, though he knew it to be futile. Sharon kept her own counsel, and if she were uncomfortable with the scenario, nothing Dutch could say would make much difference. "Jeff Crane's wife and daughter died in a looter attack in Fairfax," Sharon reported, her eyes turning down at the corners. Dutch closed his eyes and laid his head back against the office chair, picturing the woman and her child perishing in a state of fear and violence, not 15 miles from the White House. "My God, Sharon, I should have done more. The worst part, I don't even know who Jeff Crane is." "He's the lead pilot, Dutch. He's been flying us in Air Force One for 2 years. "Well, yes, I apologize. I wasn't thinking straight. Of course, Colonel Crane. How's he holding up?" "He's a patriot. He does what he must for his country, just like you." Sharon reached over the desk and put her hand on Dutch's. "Did you get done what you needed to do at Offutt?" They both knew what he had been doing, and they were both reluctant to say it out loud, as though thinking of their family while the country suffered was a dirty secret. "Yes, I did. Teddy and I gathered what we could. I hope we didn't leave the base short." "It's just an insurance policy, Dutch. Now you can focus on just one thing, fixing what is broken. Right?" Sharon looked him in the eyes, still holding his hand, lending him some of her iron strength. "Yes, let's get to work. Did Robbie make it back aboard?" "Of course he did. 1,000 horses couldn't pull him away from your side," Sharon smiled. "I think he's a new man now that he's had a shower." "Are we fully resupplied?" Dutch asked. In these 2 hours, she had become the head of the logistics team aboard Air Force One. "Yes. They're loading the last of the pallets you sent, and then we'll be ready to take off. Can I get you anything before they make us put on our seatbelts?" "Do the flight attendants stay with the plane?" Dutch raised his eyebrows in surprise. "No. We're a skeleton crew now. We have our pilot, co-pilot, Sam Greeny and his men, our family, Robbie and Janet, and your Secret Service detail. I couldn't get them to stay at the airbase, no matter how hard I argued." "Men and their duty," Dutch said, his own sense of duty inspired by the commitment of his protective detail. "Let's get America back." Chapter 24. Revived and recommitted, Dutch's team reconvened in the conference room the moment Air Force One reached cruising altitude and resumed its racetrack loop around the troubled American skies. "First," Dutch ordered, "what's our command and control plan from here? We can't stay in the air forever. The base commander at SAC told me the network of U.S. air bases is running low on maintenance and pre-flight personnel for the refueling flights, and that they might not be capable of sustaining mid-air refueling much longer." Sam Greeny stood and pointed toward the southwestern quadrant of the map. "I've taken the liberty of sending a regiment of M1 Abrams main battle tanks from Fort Bliss to meet us at Cannon Air Force Base, about 100 miles east of Albuquerque, New Mexico. The location's far enough away from population centers that we won't be forced to spend a lot of energy protecting our command and control base. The tanks should be more than enough protection. Also, winter won't be a problem that far south. We can dig in at Cannon and reestablish control with a maximum amount of resource and a minimum amount of friction. All right? Dutch pushed the meeting forward. Please give me a report on foreign threats and enemy activity. Sam Greeny addressed the small group seated around the conference table. We still have no actionable intelligence that indicates any one foreign instigator over another. We're operating on the theory that the Russians launched the power grid hack, but it could have been the North Koreans or even the Chinese. The Iranians and Saudis are bludgeoning one another back to the time of Muhammad, so I really doubt either of them had grand designs on destroying the U.S. Is anyone approaching our territory? Well, Sam rubbed his chin. The Chinese are putting to port in a fairly heavy way, but everyone's putting their naval forces to port, given the new war in the Middle East and global instability in general. The Russians are sailing everything they have, which wasn't much anyway. I'm sure their subs are on station off the East Coast, but they do that in any DEFCON 2 scenario. Our subs are sitting within firing range of Moscow. And the rest of the world? Dutch asked. As expected, the Indians and Pakistanis are massing on their borders. With our forces pulling back, that was inevitable. In Europe, not surprisingly, we're seeing the same kind of civil disorder we have here. What's strange is that some of our bases in Germany and France are reporting sectarian violence from Muslim immigrants directed at Americans. It's not anything we can't handle, but it's odd that the attacks are happening in a semi-coordinated manner so quickly after the collapse of the markets. The remnants of ISIS and ISIL are being invigorated by our misfortune, it appears. And there's a level of organization I wouldn't have predicted. Thank you, Sam. There's not much we can do on the international front. Let's focus on getting the U.S. back on its feet. Robbie, tell me where we're at with the power grid. We're dead in the water, sir. It's been 7 days since the cyber attack, and our entire team of NSA programmers addressing the hack is down to 2 guys who live at the office. I have no idea how the power company's programming teams are holding up. They're probably gone, if I had to guess. Since 2 days after the attack, our programmers have been turning into ghosts. Poof. I can't hardly blame them. Driving to work in D.C. has been tantamount to surviving Mad Max. It's not something we can reasonably ask millennial programmers to do. Our 2-week estimate for defeating the hack assumed that all teams would be working full-time. We were able to maintain that level of response for about 30 hours, then people started calling in sick. Then they quit answering their phones. Sir, there is no chance we'll get the grid back up until we've restored civil order. That's your department, Sam. Dutch turned toward the big LCD screen. America was entirely black, the power outage universal. I'll state the obvious. The map's not looking good. Around the major cities, the red had consumed all green. Any pockets of civil order created by troops had been lost, and troops had pulled outside the big cities. The orange military markers all hovered around the areas of civil disorder. We've consolidated our remaining troops around the 12 largest cities, and we're cordoning them off rather than trying to stamp out civil disorder one flashpoint at a time. Our troop numbers have declined from over 400,000 to under 200,000 due to sky-high desertion rates, especially among married servicemen. Our troops aren't stupid. They know that without the banks, there won't be paychecks. These soldiers are witnessing the worst of the civil disorder firsthand, and many of them are vanishing in the night to return to their families. Sometimes they're taking war material with them. But I'm highly confident we've shaken off the strap hangers, and now we're working with hardened men of duty, especially the officers. The remaining generals and colonels are my guys now, and they know how to execute orders. Chapter 25. What's the plan, then? Dutch wondered aloud. How do troops holding outside the cities help us restore civil order? Sam Greeny pointed to Chicago, where the red area of civil disorder looked like an octopus reaching inland from Lake Michigan. For example, we have troops blockading Chicago and Milwaukee at bridges on the interstates here, and here. Greeny pointed to a dozen or more choke points along the major interstates, where the red octopus suddenly stopped its reach from the inner burgs of Chicago. It's not a perfect barrier, but we're holding the majority, and we're stopping all vehicle traffic. By setting up checkpoints and dealing with lawless people one group at a time, we are containing the civil disorder and keeping it from spreading into the heartland. A jolt of electricity went up Dutch's spine, and his ears started to ring. Sam, looks like you're creating hellholes where Americans are being sent back to die. Is that what I'm hearing? The Secretary of Defense sighed and set down his coffee mug. Dutch, they're dying anyway. We're over a week into mass violence and hunger, particularly inside the urban areas. They're dying from violence. They're starting to die from failure of sanitation. They don't have any food. Pretty soon they'll be dying from the cold. Who is they, Sam? Dutch forced himself to breathe. I noticed there aren't any troops cording off Salt Lake City, Denver, Phoenix, or Jacksonville. Those cities aren't as violent. Plus, we don't have the troops to cover them all. So I sent men where they would make the most difference. Sam, look who you're talking to. Dutch motioned to the others in the room. We all know what it is we're seeing on this map. We were on the campaign trail together. These are all blue cities and blue states that you're quarantining. Who are you letting pass through your checkpoints? What kind of people? My exact orders were for the commanders to let anyone through who looked like they might be an asset to the heartland of America, not a liability. So the troops are profiling. Dutch hated to say it. He'd been on the opposite end of the profiling argument many times as a Republican senator and then as a Republican president. He hated to be the guy who sniped at another leader for racial or economic profiling, but he couldn't find a better word to describe it. Sam Greeny's face went red. Mr. President, do we want this country back or not? The time to quibble over equality ended a week ago. Now we're playing hardball, and you and I both know we can tell a bad guy from a good guy just by looking at him. Dutch was struck by a cascade of doubt. Considering his Secretary of Defense, was he looking at a good guy or a bad guy? So let me make sure I understand this. Dutch needed to get his arms around what he was hearing. The moral implications felt slippery, evasive. Our soldiers are turning back any refugee they think is at risk of causing civil disorder and sending them into the big cities, back into the looting and rioting. Sam tapped his pen on the back of his hand for a long second. We're also disarming them, so we're probably lowering the level of violence in the process. You're seizing firearms? From everyone? Not everyone, just the people we identify as representing a high risk of violence. So you decided on your own that we would shit-can the Second Amendment. Am I following you, Sam? Sam fired back, a gleam in his eye, brandishing more confidence than he should, considering that it was the president challenging him. I don't think you're seeing the big picture, Dutch. This collapse isn't going to turn around tomorrow or next week or even next month. For this country to recover, we'll need to come back as a different people. The liberal Democrats wanted social justice and a class of pampered poor. Now they get to live with their social engineering and die with it. Sam Greeny's voice went husky. People are going to die in the millions. We can't stop that now. It's already begun. What we can do is decide what kind of people die and what kind of people live. It's the best we can do for America now. When it's done burning, the SecDef pointed again at the map of Chicago. What remains of America will all be heartland, and we will return to something akin to 1776, a nation of good people who know how to get things done. It's like a political eugenics program, Robbie LaForth whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. We're using troops to funnel liberal voters into tearing each other to pieces. Sam Greeny thundered back. We did not cause this collapse, Robbie. We're playing the hand we've been dealt by 50 years of liberal social engineering. Let the lefties eat their own goddamn dog food. Why should our farmers pay the price for their idiocy? Dutch's head swam. If it weren't for the death and violence attached to Sam's words, he might even have agreed. Sharon knocked at the conference room door. Dutch recognized the knock, and he recognized that he needed his wife's counsel to return him to true north. Gentlemen, Dutch said with a calm that belied the horror and magnitude of the decisions they were making, I suggest a 10-minute break. Let's reconvene at 6 p.m. Chapter 26. Dutch, your parents are alive, Sharon whispered as soon as she pulled her husband into their executive suite. She glanced down the hallway to make sure no one had overheard her and closed the door. Dutch reached for the dresser and steadied himself. I don't understand. Sam lied to you. I cornered one of the communications officers and convinced him that his oath was to the president and not the Secretary of Defense. Your parents were holed up in their ranch with their staff and neighbors when the troops checked on them. They refused to evacuate. They're probably still there toughing it out. How did you know, Sharon? I suspected. I didn't know. Why would Sam lie to me about my parents? Dutch drilled the carpet with his eyes. He needed you to sidestep posse comitatus, and he knew that you would need to be knocked off your emotional game before you would consent to something like that. Am I that easy to manipulate? Dutch steadied his breathing, relief and self-doubt washing over him in alternating waves. Darling, we're all that easy to manipulate. It's just that most people don't use it as a weapon. They're alive. Dutch spoke the new truth aloud. Sharon, my folks are still alive. Sharon pulled the President of the United States to her chest while he found balance once again. Chapter 27. President Dutch McAdams returned to the conference room with his 4 Secret Service agents in tow. He turned to Sam Greeny and said in a calm voice, "Sam, I'm putting you under arrest." The SecDef launched to his feet. "Explain," he demanded. "No, I won't explain. It ends here. Gentlemen, please pat him down and take him to the press section of the plane and handcuff him to a seat. We'll leave him with the MPs at our next stop." "What are the charges?" Sam Greeny pressed while the Secret Service agents frisked him. "Does it really matter at this point?" the President answered. "Treason, lying to me about my parents, instructing troops to violate the Constitution. I'm the one America elected. The guys with the guns are with me, not you. So like I said, it ends right here." "You never did figure it out." Greeny smiled as the Secret Serviceman handcuffed his hands behind his back. "Everyone in your administration knew it but you. You're a clown, Dutch. A political bobblehead who sounds great on camera. But you aren't capable of making the hard choices or doing the tough math. My way is best for America, but you're too soft to see it through." Greeny nodded at the darkened map. The Secret Service man began to haul Sam Greeny out of the conference room, and Dutch held up a hand. "Tell me, Sam, why did you have your security detail bring frangible ammo aboard my airplane? Were you planning on seizing control of the United States right from the start?" Sam Greeny chuckled and shook his head. "You're the only person in this whole game, Dutch, who isn't thinking 3 moves ahead. You've been behind the curve since before you were elected. My advice, Dutch, for the sake of you and your family, just let it play out. You're too late to catch up. Release me and let me do my job. It'll be better for everyone." Dutch felt a stone in the pit of his stomach, the realization dawning that there might be much more he didn't know about Sam Greeny. "Are you saying you planned the collapse? That you and your compatriots did this to America?" The former Secretary of Defense chuckled. "Not at all, Dutch. Nobody can orchestrate something this big. The deep state has burned to the ground along with everything else. No, Dutch, like the Russians and the Chinese and whoever else jumped on the bandwagon when this collapse kicked off, I'm just an investor staying ahead of the market. I'm watching history in the making, and I'm setting America up for long-term gain even though we're taking a beating at the moment. We'll come out of this okay if we stick to my plan. I brought the frangible ammo on board in case you got stupid, maybe started listening to your wife's psychobabble. The frange was just a backup plan to the backup plan. Don't take it personally, Dutch. You can still come back from this mistake. Have your trained guerrillas release me and let's get back to work. The moment we walk out of this office, it will be too late." "Lock him up," Dutch ordered. The meeting broke up as 3 Secret Service men pulled Sam Greeny out of the office and headed down the hallway toward the security section. Robbie turned left behind them, following the men and their prisoner toward the back of the plane. The President headed toward his stateroom, stewing on Greeny's disdain. Chapter 28. Before Dutch had taken 6 steps towards his stateroom, the plane exploded in gunfire. A ricochet buzzed down the hallway, and Dutch's Secret Service man shoved him to the floor, covering him with his body, searching for targets with his Glock. The firefight farther aft of the airplane continued. A whining howl wailed underneath the staccato bursts of handgun fire. Dutch caught sight of Sharon, peeking through the doorway to the presidential suite. "Get back inside. Take cover behind the dresser. Do it now," Dutch shouted, thinking of his son and daughter probably seated at the back of the airplane. A man thundered down the stairway from the upper level and opened fire when he saw Dutch's Secret Service agent. The agent returned fire, forcing the comms officer to take cover around the corner of the stairs. The handgun rounds disappeared into the walls of the airplane, doing untold damage. Dutch's Secret Service agent and the assailant from the communications room screamed at one another to drop their weapons, nobody willing to back down. A dull thud came from up above. A comms officer, Confederate of Sam Greeny, tumbled down the stairs, ass over tea kettle. He sprawled limp when he hit the floor in front of Dutch. The Secret Service agent shot the man in the face, then twisted to meet any new threats coming down the stairs. "Don't shoot!" Another man from the comms room stepped slowly down the stairs, holding a Halliburton Zero hard-sided suitcase over his head. "I knocked him out for you. Don't shoot. I'm one of the good guys." The Air Force aide-de-camp slowly descended the steps, holding the nuclear football high. "Get back up there and keep control of the comm center. Take that gun," the Secret Service agent yelled, nodding to the dead man, apparently convinced of the aide-de-camp's loyalty to the president. Dutch scrambled forward, picking up the dead man's Beretta. "We all fight. My children are back there." Dutch pointed toward the back of the airplane with the Beretta. He turned to the aide-de-camp, Captain Spillenek. "Grab a gun from the weapons locker upstairs and get your ass back down here to help." Dutch searched the dead man and found another magazine in one of his pockets. Hugging tightly to the wall, he gained his feet and stalked down the hallway toward the now sporadic shooting. The Secret Service agent pushed past him, apparently accepting Dutch's decision to fight, but unwilling to let the president take the first few rounds. The hallway narrowed and turned when they hit the conference room door. Dutch could see the lower half of a body on the ground, and nausea rose as he recognized Robbie LaForth's slacks. The Secret Service agent crouched low and took a snap peek around the corner. No gunfire followed. The fight had apparently devolved into a Mexican standoff between the office section and the security section of the plane. "Sir, our Secret Service team must have ducked into the office section when they started taking fire. Don't lean into the corridor. It's a fatal funnel. Someone has it covered from the rear of the plane." "Agent Brooks," Dutch yelled around the corner. "What's your status? Do you have my children with you?" The head of security replied, "Sir, we have Greenie, and we're all three good to go in here. Nobody else was in this compartment. Mr. LaForth is down." "We have your kids," an unknown voice shouted from the security section at the back of the plane. "Cut Sam Greenie loose. We'll send your kids up. Straight trade. We'll give you 2 for 1 even." Captain Spillenek, the aide-de-camp, armed with a handgun, joined Dutch and his agent in the passageway. The aircraft intercom blared before Dutch could reply to the gunman's demands. Chapter 29. "I don't know what's going on back there," the pilot spoke calmly over the intercom, "but my aircraft is leaking air. Whatever it is you're doing, please stop or we'll all die. I've got another hour or so of oxygen before you all pass out." "Just let me go, Dutch," Sam Greenie shouted from the office section. "You're not going to win this. Even if you do, I'm the only one who has a chance of pulling this mess back together. The generals on the ground are all mine. I made sure of it." Sharon appeared behind Dutch, pressed against the wall of the hallway. Dutch considered ordering her back to the executive suite, but realized she wouldn't go back while their children were in danger. "How do you see this playing out, Sam?" Dutch yelled, buying time for his children. "You think you and I are going to head back to work now that your private assassins have killed Robbie? Is that what you're imagining?" "You're not offering any solutions for the country, Dutch. I am. Let me do my job. Let's put the plane down, you get off with your people and the trinkets you picked up at SAC. We patch that hole. You give me the nuclear football and written authority to continue operating military command. I'll fly away to do my job for the country. You stay on the ground to do your job for your family." "There's no way in hell," Dutch shouted, but Sharon clamped her hand on his arm, interrupting him. "Do it," she hissed into Dutch's ear. "Trust me. Give him what he wants." Dutch swiveled on his heels and stared intensely at his wife, trying to gauge her intention. Slowly he pivoted toward the ugly negotiation, holding his country in one hand and his family in the other. What kind of man sacrifices his family for his country? What kind of man sacrifices his country for his family? Dutch already knew his answers, but he paused to weigh his honor and the lives of hundreds of millions that hung in the balance. "Trust me," Sharon repeated. "Okay." Dutch swallowed hard before he said his next words. "I need to show a good faith, and we'll do it your way. Have your men send Abigail forward, and I'll route the plane toward a contingency landing site. You'll get everything you want, and everything you deserve," Dutch fumed secretly, biding his time. Sam Greenie instructed his men to let the president's daughter go. A few moments later, Abigail dashed into the hallway and ran into the arms of her mother. The two women hurried to safer quarters at the nose of the aircraft. Dutch nodded at the Secret Service agent, and the aide-de-camp lifted slowly out of his crouch and moved toward his office. As he walked past Robbie LaForth's lifeless body, conviction overtook Dutch. He would dishonor Robbie's death if he handed command to Sam Greeny. So many had made the ultimate sacrifice to defend the United States of America, and now Dutch McAdams would trade it away for the life of his son. The thought caused his knees to go weak, and Dutch stepped into his office to gather his thoughts before turning Air Force One toward a landing place for his family. Like everything else in life, this crossroads wasn't simple. The nation Dutch had been elected to lead had made its choice. It had decided to abandon the rule of law. Dutch knew he was placing blame on hungry, desperate people, but in the end they were voters, not blundering cattle. They chose to end their government, and many would die with that choice on their breath. Dutch hadn't been elected to force people into doing the right thing, or even the smart thing. By rioting and rejecting the leadership of the United States government, the people had effectively impeached him and every other elected official. Of course, not everyone had made the choice to loot and riot, but enough had chosen lawlessness that the military had been able to put the genie back in the bottle. The inner-city populations had voted with their feet, plain and simple. This train of thought brought Dutch back to Sam Greeny's brutal plan. Was locking inner-city rioters into their self-made hell really such a bad idea? Preserving the heartland for capable survivors made a lot of sense, at least on paper. And that was the rub. Dutch had seen it more times than he could count. Policies that looked good on paper, that resulted in incalculable evil. Dutch had long ago learned that a decision not only had to look good on paper, but it had to pass the smell test. Greeny's plan smelled foul to the president. Dutch could describe his disagreement in 20 ways, but it all boiled down to the reality that his soul could not abide it. But Dutch wasn't going to sacrifice his son to hold that line. He would find another way. Chapter 30. Alone in his office, Dutch settled on Mountain Home, Idaho, as their landing place. More than 40 miles from Boise and almost 300 miles from Salt Lake City, the Spartan Cold War strategic bomber base would give the first family a remote location to put down, far from inquisitive eyes and angry mobs. More importantly, the plane could reach Mountain Home before they all died of hypoxia. The satellite feed on Dutch's laptop showed southern Idaho to be an area between farms and sprawling gray swaths of desert. It looked like a place he could hide his face and rebuild the government. Southern Idaho would be their last stand, both as a family and as a presidency. Dutch picked up his phone and played the last chip in his stack. "Captain Spillenek," Dutch said to his aide-de-camp now running the comm center, "please call ahead to Mountain Home Air Force Base. Let them know we have a priority landing coming their way in about 2 hours. Tell them it's a Code Raptor 300 event, and request that 3 strikers mobilize out of Boise with minimal crew, all single males, to meet us at Mountain Home. Do you copy the last?" "Yes, sir. Radio Mountain Home AFB, let them know a Code Raptor 300 event is coming in 120 minutes. Scramble 3 strikers out of the armory in Boise with a skeleton crew fully equipped, all single males, to meet us at the airfield." "Correct. And Captain," the president said, "do not tell them we're Air Force One or that the first family is aboard. You got that? Please let the pilot know to change course." "Roger, sir." Dutch hung up the phone, closed his laptop, and headed into the presidential suite to check on his wife and daughter. Both women were sitting on the edge of the bed talking when Dutch entered. Abigail had been crying. "We're heading toward southern Idaho. We'll land in about 2 hours. What do you think?" Sharon nodded approval. "Abigail was just telling me that Sam Greeny's men had been preparing to take over the plane since we left off it. They had Abby and Teddy restrained in the security section, waiting for the signal from Greeny." It made sense. The new men Greeny traded out for his Delta security detail must have been plants who'd been on the airplane since D.C., probably sitting in the back posing as staff. That meant Sam had at least 7 combat operators on board when they took off. The men must have been standing by since before the California nuke. There'd be no other way Sam could have had them ready in time to board the plane. "Makes me wonder if we were the only ones that didn't see this collapse coming," Dutch said. "How could Sam have known the threat was so serious?" He scratched his head. Sharon thought about it. "We were hearing it on the news a few times a week for the last couple of years. I couldn't watch the news without seeing some kind of doomsday scenario. Climate catastrophes, credit bubbles, solar flares, volcanoes, flu, and EMP threats from rogue nations. She shrugged. Maybe Sam Greeny was just playing the odds. He wasn't picking up the tab for having a team of commandos standing at the ready. Why not invest in any possible outcome? Sam's not the kind of man who'd ever stand by and be happy with your successes, Dutch. I'm sure he always saw himself as the rightful leader of the country, a sociopathic, paranoid bastard. The hammering of gunfire echoed down the plane's fuselage. Dutch motioned for his wife and daughter to stay behind the furniture, and he rushed down the hallway, drawing his handgun from the back of his belt and pulling up short of the cover provided by the bulge of the conference room. The shooting stopped. An eerie quiet descended over Air Force One, broken only by the whine of the engines and the whistle of air escaping through bullet holes. Chapter 31. "Report, Agent Brooks," Dutch called around the corner. "We're all good here, sir. I just had a shootout back in the security section. From the sound of it, I believe one of the Army operators had a bone to pick regarding their loyalties, and he dropped the hammer on one of his buddies." "Teddy," Dutch yelled. "You okay back there?" "He's fine," one of the operators yelled from the rear compartment. Someone muffled Teddy's shouts, probably gagging him. "We got things under control. Stay out of this section or the kid dies." Dutch rounded the corner and darted into the office staff section. His 4 Secret Service men crouched behind a desk that they'd propped up as a barricade. Sam Greeny sat handcuffed to a chair in the corner, a blank look on his face. "My money's on someone having died back there, Mr. President. Maybe more than one. Should we consider rushing them, sir?" "Do we have a solid count?" Dutch asked. "We did before the shooting." One of the agents, Dutch didn't know his name, answered. "There were 4 men plus the one we killed on the staircase. Now it could be less. But we could be walking into an even gunfight, and they're posted up on the hallway. We have to assume they're some kind of SOF guys, maybe Delta, maybe 4 SEALs. Even with only 2 operators back there, and even if they didn't have a hostage, the odds wouldn't be good." "Hold position," Dutch ordered. "We play this out for more time. Has anyone checked on the hole in the plane?" "I found it. It's in the outside wall of the staff office," the lead agent, Brooks, answered. "One of the 9mm rounds hit a seam in the aluminum and punched straight through. I tried to plug the hole with a plastic patch and it might have helped, but we can still hear the pressure escaping around the patch. The pilot says we can lose pressure like this for maybe an hour before we go hypoxic. Maybe twice that if the pilot flies lower. After that, we'll need to wear the oxygen masks. If the bullet had blown out a window, it'd be a different story." "Someone moved Robbie's body," Dutch noted, his voice heavy. "We moved him and the dead comms guy into the staff office until we can offload them." "Gentlemen," a quiet voice interrupted. The Air Force aide-de-camp motioned for them to come forward on the plane. "Can I show you something?" Dutch and the lead agent, Brooks, slipped around the dogleg in the hallway and quietly followed the young Air Force officer upstairs to the comm center. The 3 men filed up the narrow staircase and entered a room packed with computer monitors. A few 1980s-era radio sets still held a place on the wall, but almost everything else had been converted into computerized communication transceivers. A door opened at the far end of the comm center, and Sharon stepped through from the nose of the plane, the flight deck and pilots behind her. "Just like Sharon," Dutch mused, checking on everyone to make sure their needs are being met. She slipped past them while touching Dutch's arm and headed down the staircase. "After the shooting, I poked around the Wi-Fi network on the plane and found not 1 but 2 computers still on the network. Both the screens, fore and aft, in the security and passenger compartments aren't actually television screens, they're computer monitors. Somebody probably wanted to have more flexibility for presentations, so they installed full monitors. Check it out. That means they have built-in cameras." The young officer hit the return key, and a rear-facing view of the aft security compartment appeared. Both Dutch and Agent Brooks leaned forward, gobbling up the new information. "There's only 2 of them," Brooks pointed out. "See that foot on the floor?" He nodded toward a boot poking around a row of airplane seats. "That's a dead man. You seen anyone but these 2 guys and the hostage?" "I was only watching them for a minute before I went to get you, so I can't be sure there isn't another guy hiding out somewhere. He could be in the John." "There's Teddy." Dutch touched the screen. The back of his son's head with his flyaway blonde hair poked above a seat. He's in back row, facing away. "Here." The aide-de-camp hit another key, and the view toggled to a head-on shot of Teddy, bound and gagged. "This is the other computer monitor. It's facing the opposite direction." Other than appearing uncomfortable, Teddy seemed fine. "Okay, gentlemen." Dutch stood back and folded his arms. How do we use this information to keep our nation out of the hands of a psychopath? Chapter 32. Sir, when you loaded the supplies from Offutt, did you requisition any M84 grenades? Agent Brooks asked, excitement mounting in his voice. I have no idea what I grabbed. Are you former military, Brooks? Marsoc Marine, sir. An M84 is a flashbang grenade. Looks like a V8 juice can with a big handle, a ring, and a bunch of holes drilled in the sides. Dutch remembered the scene at the Air Force Armory. I recall a bunch of little baseball-looking grenades, then some skinny grenades with holes. We can't use the fragmentation grenades, the ones like baseballs. The overpressure and frag would compromise the hull of the aircraft. I'm pretty sure the flashbang won't hurt the plane, though. Don't we want a grenade to cause damage? Dutch asked. Well, yeah, but not so much it'll kill your boy or split a seam in the aircraft. And if those guys are Delta or anything in that family of operator, we'll need to do more than flashbang them to put them back on their heels. Those men will be dedicated adversaries. First things first. Did they load the grenades in the forward compartment or the rear? I'm not sure. I think the food pallets got forklifted into the back. I'm guessing they loaded the other stuff up front to balance the load. Good. The forward lower compartment is right down the stairs up front. Let me check to see if the grenades are up front where I can get at them. Maybe Jesus is smiling on us all. How much time do we have? The agent looked at his watch. Dutch looked at his own watch and did the math. I have to check with the pilot, but I think we're about 90 minutes out from Mountain Home, which means we might be sucking thin air before then, depending on how good your patch worked. Best guess, we'll be on the edge of passing out in less than an hour. Why don't we just wait until they pass out and then get Teddy? The aide-de-camp offered. We don't have mobile oxygen on this aircraft. If they pass out, we pass out. If we have oxygen masks, they have oxygen masks. We can breathe through our little masks hanging from the ceiling, but then we're in no position to assault. They'd be breathing off their ceiling masks and shooting from fixed positions. We're the ones who need to be mobile, not them. Everyone nodded, thinking about their complicated reality. Fighting aboard an aircraft at 30,000 feet against trained commandos with a hostage. All that, and they had a whistling clock ticking away their air. Agent Brooks broke the reverie. First things first. If we can get a couple M84s, we might have options. Meet up in the Oval Office in 10. Chapter 33. Agent Brooks thunked down 2 grenades on the president's desk. We're in business. We need to find something we can use to generate light fragmentation. 16-penny nails would be perfect. I doubt there are any nails on the plane, but I have a whole case of stainless steel Mont Blanc pens that we give away when we sign treaties. Dutch stood, dug around in his credenza, and came back with a cardboard box full of gleaming steel pens. Perfect. Agent Brooks grabbed one and twisted it into 2 metal tubes, dropping the ink insert back into the box. We can tape 100 of these around the grenades, and they might act like flechettes. I think they'll stick into anything and everything, including the operators. The airframe should be fine. I didn't think an airplane could tolerate the pressure from a grenade. Dutch vaguely remembered something about a terrorist with a little bit of C4 explosive in his shoe, posing a serious threat to an airliner. Brooks shook his head. Air Force One is actually designed to withstand the M84 flashbang. We bring them aboard when we have dodgy foreign nationals in the press section. There are 4 times as many overpressure valves on this 747 as on commercial models. We're good. Also, I found more 9mm frangible ammo in the weapons locker left over from the last time we flew with Saudis aboard. Even frange can damage the hull and the electronics, but it's better than shooting ball ammo. How do we protect Teddy from getting hit? Dutch looked at the camera's view, Teddy's head poking over the seat back. Your son studied French, right? The aide-de-camp said. I've started rotating photos of France from my iPhone on both screens, just like screensavers. I think they all fell for it. The commandos haven't paid any attention to the monitors. We're so accustomed to screensavers, it's not something we notice anymore. The young officer smiled at his mental victory over the trained operators. I can start running random phrases in French and then slip in a few warnings. If we can get your son to duck and cover when the grenades fly, he should be fine. Look, the young officer pointed to the screen as he flipped back to the rear monitor. Teddy's paying attention to the screensaver. The monitor showed Teddy looking directly at the camera, eyes wide. Do you know French? Dutch asked. My family's Quebecois, the young officer said and smiled. Agent Brooks pointed at the rows of chairs behind Teddy. The flechette shouldn't penetrate more than 2 rows of airplane seats at most. Teddy's 4 rows back. If he gets his head down, I don't see how he'd get hit." The agent held up his hands. "But it's your call, sir." Dutch considered his conflicting obligations. His country, his family, his son. Fathers across this once great nation were watching their children starve. At least Dutch's and Teddy's risk might make a difference. "Let's do it," he decided, leaving the outcome to fate. "Sir, one more thing." Agent Brooks cringed. "I'll be going in first on the assault. I'd like to use Secretary Greeny as a human shield. I know that probably offends your sense of honor, but those operators will think twice before they shoot their boss. At least, I hope they'll think twice." Dutch interrupted him. "Fuck that guy. Pardon my French. He's holding my son hostage. Cut off his head and stick it on a pole if you think it'll help." Chapter 34. In French, the monitor read, "The grenades arrive soon. Prepare to cover your head." President McAdams, Agent Brooks, and the Air Force aide-de-camp watched the words appear on the screen, then disappear. Teddy nodded emphatically into the camera, now fully aware of the scheme. "They didn't notice the text." The young man rubbed his hands together. "They should have spent more time studying in high school, less time lifting weights." "They're getting lax," Agent Brooks observed. "They've been on point for over an hour, and they're letting down a bit, assuming we won't come at them while they have a hostage. If we pitch the flashbangs just past the first row of seats, they should get a face full of stainless steel." "Is there any reason not to go right now?" Dutch asked. "Yes, we should go now, but you misunderstood, Mr. President. Under no circumstance will I allow you to participate in this assault." Agent Brooks set his feet. "Tell you what, Agent Brooks." Dutch switched into negotiation mode. "I'll be your backup if things go sideways. I'll hang back in the office section unless I'm needed. That's my final offer." Dutch held up the Beretta to prove to the Secret Service agent that he was going in one way or the other. The agent would have to wrestle the gun away from the president to stop him. "Okay, then it's 5 of us going in, the president in reserve and the Secretary of Defense out front." "This should work," Agent Brooks said. At 63 years old, it had been almost 50 years since Dutch had been in a physical confrontation with another man. Even so, he remembered those schoolyard brawls, and he wondered how he would respond to combat in the real world, with real bullets. With combat looming, Dutch had to ask, "Am I a coward?" Once when Dutch had been walking his girlfriend home from middle school, her books in his arms, an older boy from high school confronted them on the sidewalk, smacked the books to the ground, and taunted Dutch with insults against the girl's maidenhood. Dutch feigned helplessness. Since the high school boy had 50 pounds and 3 inches of reach on him, acting helpless made sense. But in that moment, Dutch's mind worked out a plan to inflict maximum damage on the bigger boy. Dutch acted as though he was turning away, and then he'd loaded every pound of force he could into his hips and let loose the biggest haymaker of his life, directly into the center of the bigger boy's face. The high school boy had gone down hard on the sidewalk. The boy had looked up at Dutch and his girlfriend, swiped away the blood gushing from his nose, and said, "Now I'm going to beat the shit out of you." Dutch had been too astonished at the success of his gambit to realize he should have set to kicking the boy as soon as he'd hit the ground. Instead, he'd let him get up. Just then a police car had rolled up to the curb, and a sheriff's deputy jumped out to break up the fight. Noticing the obvious size difference between the boys, and looking back and forth at the gushing blood coming from the high school boy's face, the officer had fist-bumped Dutch on the shoulder. "Nice job. Now get the hell out of here and quit fighting." To this day, Dutch didn't know for sure if he had it in him to stomp a man on the ground. He yearned to know what he would do to win back his son or fulfill his duty to his country. Dutch slide-checked the breech on his Beretta, already knowing there was a round in the chamber. He looked at the video screen one last time. "Let's get this done." Chapter 35. Agent Brooks gagged the Secretary of Defense. The Secret Service agent had a death grip on the SecDef's belt in his left hand, his Glock in his right. Behind him, another Secret Service agent held the 2 taped and bulging flashbangs, one in each hand. Behind him, the other 2 agents had their Glocks at the high ready. Looking rather small by comparison, the president's aide-de-camp held a revolver, standing last in line. Everyone, including Sam Greeny, wore body armor. The president stood a couple of paces back, pretending to hold in reserve. Not for a moment did Dutch contemplate staying there, but if it made Agent Brooks feel better, he would happily act as though he'd be avoiding the fight. Agent Brooks didn't wait for permission. "Go, go, go," he hissed. The stack of men, the president at the rear, flowed into the hallway, charging toward the security section of Air Force One. Only later would Dutch piece together the cobra-fast sequence of events. He never saw the grenades being thrown, but Dutch heard the enemy operators shout, "Grenade!" Agent Brooks pushed into the entryway and crouched behind the Secretary of Defense. The thunder and flash overwhelmed Dutch's senses, even at the back of the line. How could men be standing up to the gut-twisting overpressure of the explosion? But the enemy operators were phased for only a split second. They poured gunfire down the hallway, shooting expertly around Greenie. Agent Brooks returned fire, and the second agent in line drew his handgun and joined the fight. The four men pushed into the room, firing at the operators, shooting in and around the airline seats. Dutch's aide-de-camp fell back onto him and looked up, a gout of blood pulsing from his throat. Something clicked in Dutch, like a door slamming on a section of his mind. He recognized the mortal wound and dropped the man to the floor, pushing forward, hunting to bring his own gun to bear. One of the Secret Service men dropped, clutching his chest, and Dutch filled the gap, dumping round after round into the men behind the seats, doing his best to pull his rounds away from where his son would be hiding. Dutch's weapon sights were the furthest thing from his mind. He smashed the trigger over and over, seeing the bloody faces of the enemy operators bobbing above and around the airplane seats, chunks of flesh apparently blown off by the grenade, but doing nothing to slow their commitment to combat. Sam Greenie mule-kicked Agent Brooks and launched himself onto the floor toward the security section, landing face first and clearing the hallway for his men to shoot unrestricted. Agent Brooks took several rounds to the chest, and Dutch saw one splash off the man's shoulder, splattering Dutch's face with blood. "Back, back, back!" Brooks screamed as he dropped the magazine out of his Glock, rammed another one home, and resumed firing. Dutch was the first to duck around the corner back into the office section, bullets whizzing into the plastic and aluminum surfaces of the plane. Miraculously, all four Secret Service agents followed. They were bleeding from extremity wounds. One had been grazed across the head, and all of them had been shot in the body armor. Dutch was the only man to escape unscathed. "Motherfucker, those bastards are tough," one of the Secret Service agents wheezed, likely suffering from broken ribs. The five men gulped air and coughed, alive but defeated. The truth of their failure soon eclipsed the rush of adrenaline. Dutch's son remained in the hands of ruthless killers. Chapter 36. The firefight had further damaged the airframe, and the whistling from the hull could be heard coming from several locations. Dutch didn't need to ask the pilot. He knew they would be landing or losing consciousness soon. During the fight, the oxygen masks had popped out of the ceiling. "Dutch," the Secretary of Defense called out, now together with his commandos in the security section. Greenie didn't even sound injured. "I respect the effort, but now I got to do some things I would have rather avoided." "Is Teddy okay?" Dutch ignored the threats. "Oh, he's fine, but he won't be." Teddy began to scream. Then the pitch of that scream climbed to an animal shriek. Dutch launched forward into the corridor, a blind lunge toward his son. One of the Secret Service agents hooked Dutch's arm and wrestled him back from the shooting lane. He pinned Dutch in an iron wrestler's hold while the young man passed through his chorus of agony. Teddy's shrieking abated, and Dutch let out a choked sob, impossibly relieved to hear him weeping rather than silenced. Something sailed into the office section and thunked to the ground in front of Dutch. His brain struggled to place the bloody mass until his mind reluctantly recognized a trim fingernail, and he surrendered his denial. His son's severed finger leaked blood on the beige carpet of the airplane. Dutch's eyes lost focus, and the bile burned in his stomach. A finger, his son's finger, maimed forever, but alive, still alive. "I'm sorry, Dutch, but pieces of your son will keep coming if you don't put this plane on the ground and give me the launch codes and your authorization to act as Commander-in-Chief. We're done playing." In 5 minutes' time, Dutch had learned two things about himself. One, that he was no coward in a fight. Two, that all it took to evaporate his will was his son's severed finger. As Teddy cried in the background, and as the airframe of Air Force One warbled its death wail, Dutch McAdams surrendered the presidency to a man nobody would have ever elected. "Okay, Sam, you win. I'll get you the codes." Chapter 37. Please take your seats and buckle your seatbelts. We're on final approach, the pilot warned over the intercom. Considering the 5 dead bodies, uncountable flesh wounds, and Dutch's tortured son in the security section, the safety warning sounded like a cruel joke. Procedure will be procedure, Dutch supposed, his mind drifting on the come-down tide of adrenaline. Even so, Dutch sat in his office chair and buckled his seatbelt. He wondered if Sam Greeny would try to seize the airplane before they could offload. Dutch still had his Secret Service detail, so the 2 teams of fighting men would still probably cancel one another out. His men were all severely wounded, and he had no doubt the commandos were injured as well. Dutch doubted that anyone wanted another gunfight. At this point, the variables of the situation were spread all over the map. Sam Greeny had been right. Dutch had never been good at looking 3 steps ahead. He'd already handed the nuclear football over to Sam, but he refused to give him the combination to the suitcase locks. Also, Dutch withheld the letter of authorization, holding it until his family and supplies were off the plane. It was the best he could do. Dutch felt his defeat, whole and unmistakable. He knew he was handing the remnants of America over to a soulless tyrant. The aircraft trembled as the wheels contacted asphalt. Dutch inhaled, subconsciously allowing himself to breathe again. He looked out at endless sage and rolling hills racing past his window. The Idaho desolation was to be their new home, and if the handoff went according to plan, the desolation might be their savior. He unbuckled his seat and headed out of his office to shepherd Sharon and Abigail down the jetway, hungry to get as much of his family off the plane as he could. The women had gathered up the most rugged clothes they could find, even while Teddy sat bleeding and maimed in the back of the plane. Everyone had to do what they could to survive. Something about that refrain struck Dutch as a new and permanent reality. Get used to it, he told himself. He watched his wife and daughter descend the built-in jetway on Air Force One. They stepped down and greeted the soldiers, wide-eyed and gawking at the unexpected arrival of the president's airplane. The 3 armored vehicles he requested and 2 Humvees awaited. Dutch moved aft toward the no-man's land between the office section and the security section of the airplane. Sam Greeny and his commandos hid in their section, giving Dutch no idea as to their disposition. For all he knew, the operators could have died from their wounds. Sam, we're disembarking and unloading our gear. Send Teddy out now. Unseen behind the bulkhead, Sam Greeny shouted back, "With respect, sir, fuck you. You'll get him when I get my letter and the combination to the briefcase. Don't toy with me or I'll send you the middle finger, literally. Also get those airmen refueling us and patching the holes. You're lucky I'm even going to let you have your prepper crap. I don't have to do that, you know." Sharon must have been handling offloading logistics with the airbase because Dutch heard the sound of forklifts and felt the airframe vibrate as the cargo doors opened. "I'm going to make sure the mechanics are en route. My men will stay right here," Dutch threatened. He didn't want Greeny to get the idea that he held all the cards. Agent Brooks, still bleeding from the open wound on his shoulder, gave Dutch a thumbs up. "Dutch, if you want your boy back with his hand still attached, you'll stay here. I don't want you going anywhere. And throw us the big med kit. Do it in the next 10 minutes or I'm going to have them cut off his right hand," Greeny demanded. It was an unnecessary threat, but Sam Greeny apparently enjoyed making them. As he picked up the phone on the wall, Dutch couldn't imagine how he had overlooked the malignant soul in his pick for Secretary of Defense. Chapter 38. Air Force One taxied away moments after Dutch McAdams descended the stairs, holding Teddy up as his son stumbled down the jetway. All their supplies had been forklifted down, the holes in the airframe hastily patched, and medical supplies thrown to Sam Greeny and his hired shooters. The exchange was done, but Dutch hadn't surrendered. Dutch had given Greeny the letter and the combination to the nuclear suitcase in exchange for his boy, but he had promised himself he would destroy the plane before he would let Sam Greeny get away. "Did you tell them to shoot it down?" Dutch yelled at Sharon as he passed Teddy off to an Air Force medic and ran toward the armored vehicles. When Sharon replied with a bewildered look, Dutch veered toward the nearest striker. "Destroy that plane now," Dutch shouted. The reservist stumbled about the vehicle looking for some kind of command authorization. "I'm your commander-in-chief," Dutch roared. "You don't need to confirm my order. "Shoot it down." The crew commander finally grasped the order and bellowed to a crewman to bring up ammo for the 50 cal. While the men struggled to load the huge machine gun on top of the Striker, Air Force One thundered past on the opposite runway, taking to the sky just as the top plate on the machine gun slammed shut. The Browning M2 exploded to life, the line of tracers lagging 100 yards behind the plane as it banked off the runway. The machine gunner corrected, firing a string that chased the 747 but fell short and to the outside of its banking turn. The machine gunner elevated his next burst and placed the glowing rope exactly where the jetliner had been moments before, still falling behind. The belt expended, the assistant gunner quickly laid another belt into the feed tray and slapped the top plate closed. Air Force One continued to climb, now almost 2 miles away. The machine gunner continued firing, trying to walk the line of tracers into a target approaching a speed of 300 miles an hour. If he scored any hits, it had no apparent effect on the aircraft. When the massive din from the machine gun died, the machine gunner apologized. "I'm sorry, sir. That's my first time shooting at an aircraft. I'm sorry. I've never attempted anything like this." Sharon stepped beside her husband as he ran his fingers through his silver hair over and over again. "Oh, my God, Sharon, I let him get away with the codes. Oh, my God." She took his hand in both of hers, calming him. "Dutch, it's going to be okay." A familiar face stepped out from behind the Striker, and Dutch took a second to recognize the co-pilot from Air Force One. Dutch turned to his wife, struggling to understand. Sharon looked at him with hard eyes, sadness and resolve playing across her face. It had been the same expression a year earlier when she had urged him to fire his Secretary of State. With those same eyes, she looked toward the horizon, toward the dwindling shape of Air Force One. "Jeff said he'd be willing to make the sacrifice if it came to that," Sharon explained without taking her eyes off the aircraft. "Jeff's wife and daughter are gone, so dying for his country would be a gift," he said. Dutch watched the plane make a slow banking turn. Then it tipped nose forward and banked in the opposite direction. "Not everyone in this country has forgotten about honor." Sharon spoke the pilot's epithet. Air Force One angled from the sky at full speed, then suddenly disappeared into the side of a mountain, a mile-wide starburst erupting from the gray rock. A massive, silent fireball rolled into the sky. 20 seconds later, the sound of ripping thunder reached the airfield. "Sweet Mary, Mother of God," Dutch whispered. "He said it'd be a gift." Sharon turned toward Dutch and leaned her forehead against the side of his head, her tears trickling down his sideburn. "We aren't the kind of people who let a monster hold America in his hand, and neither was Jeff Crane. That wouldn't be something we could live with." "This was you?" Dutch pleaded with her for understanding. "Jeff, the pilot. He and I agreed that this would be best, if it came to that." She had always been the knife's edge in their partnership, the carbon steel to his hickory grip. While Dutch struggled to think 3 moves ahead, Sharon did it in her sleep. "May God have mercy on their souls," Dutch intoned, the finality of their struggle finally dawning on him. Epilogue. Within hours of the death of Air Force One, a new struggle unfolded. Primal, ruthless, and never-ending. If he ever forgot the brutality of their new life, Dutch had only to look at his son and the stump of his left pinky finger. Gone was the boy who studied French and loved video games. His son had learned the lessons Dutch wanted him to learn, but those lessons had come at a horrific cost, evaporating the twinkle in the boy's eye and hurtling him into the calloused manhood he would likely need to survive. Several weeks had passed, and winter closed in on southern Idaho. Fleeing from the dangers of civilization, their caravan of 3 Strikers and 3 Humvees struck deep into the gray shale deserts of Idaho and Nevada, seeking refuge as far from human habitation as possible. In the end, it was the Shoshone-Paiute Indians of the Duck Valley Indian Reservation who took them in. Despite their deeply troubled history with the United States, the Shoshone-Paiutes graciously offered a home to the U.S. government in absentia, giving the president and his people medical care for their wounds, fresh food, and above all else, secrecy. 3 miles outside of town, wedged between a reservoir and a mountainside, the McAdams family, their Secret Service detail, and 25 young men from Mountain Home Air Force Base and the Idaho National Guard set up a heavily armed garrison, protecting themselves and defending the entryway to the tiny Native American town of Owyhee, Nevada. Their ability to crush marauding gangs with high-tech weaponry more than made up for the nuisance of having strange, white faces in town. The McAdams and their team set out into the wilderness with 2 communication specialists from Mountain Home, together with their Cinque-Gars Humvee. The communications men joined the president's entourage in order to monitor events, and perhaps someday to reconnect with fragments of the government and military. For now, Dutch didn't think he had anything to say to the military commanders in the field that they couldn't come up with on their own. As Dutch McAdams sat atop a Stryker armored vehicle performing his turn on guard duty, Sharon joined him. Dutch pulled her close and wrapped his heavy parka around them both, steeling them against the snowstorm building on the northern horizon. "It's beautiful," Dutch said. "I'd forgotten how majestic it is to live outdoors." Sharon smiled. "I might enjoy the majesty of it more when I finally forget what a hot shower feels like. I'm still grieving what was." "Our family made it, Sharon. We're incredibly blessed." "Except Robbie," she corrected. They sat in silence for a moment, remembering their friend. "I spend a lot of time thinking about what I could have done differently to change things. Maybe if I hadn't called troops into the cities, the riots would have burned out and food shipments would have resumed. Maybe if I'd never appointed Sam Graney in the first place, things might have ended a lot better." "I've been thinking about it too, Dutch." Sharon regarded the coming snow flurry. "No civilization ever lasted forever. Sooner or later, every great civilization convinces itself that it's entitled to more. When human selfishness exceeds our ability to care for others, we reap the whirlwind. We call forth the storm, Dutch. It didn't just happen. We called it up. No president was ever going to stop that." Dutch thought back to the expression on her face as she watched the fiery death of Sam Graney and his commandos, an execution she had arranged. That memory struggled to exist in the same universe as the graceful woman sitting beside him, her cold-dappled cheeks flushing red in the winter wind. The first fat snowflakes settled on Dutch and Sharon, blown from the storm, traveling probably 5 miles before making landfall. "Time for you to get indoors." Dutch unwrapped his parka from around her shoulder. "What's one more squall?" She chuckled and pulled his parka back around herself. "They come and then they go. You and I, and hopefully our kids, we're the kind of family who steps into the storm." This has been The Last Air Force One, a post-apocalyptic thriller, Black Autumn Companion Series Book 1. Written by Jeff Kirkham and Jason Ross. Narrated by Kevin Pierce. Copyright 2018 by Jeff Kirkham and Jason Ross. Production copyright 2019 by Jeff Kirkham and Jason Ross.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.